Welcome, dear friend. Tonight we embark on a journey of peace, wisdom, and stillness. As gentle rain patters softly in the background and delicate piano notes weave through the air, I will share timeless proverbs, words that have carried comfort, guidance, and hope across generations. This is a space to unwind, breathe deeply, and let the noise of the day fade away. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from tonight? Whether you're wrapped in a blanket on a cold evening or lying under warm tropical skies, your presence here makes this moment more special. Now let us settle in, close our eyes, and let the rain, music, and words guide us into deep rest. A soft rain falls in the distance, its rhythm gentle, unhurried, as though the sky itself has decided to hum a lullaby for the earth. The air is cool, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and fresh leaves. Somewhere, just beyond a small hill, a pale lantern glows in the mist. Its light is steady, though the fog curls and drapes itself around it like a silvery shawl. A lone traveller walks the winding path toward that warm, golden light. His cloak is worn from many journeys, the edges frayed, but it keeps him dry enough to continue. Each step presses softly into the damp soil, leaving quiet footprints that will soon be washed away by the rain. In the distance, the lantern sways gently in the breeze, cradled by the hand of someone who has been waiting. As the traveller draws nearer, he sees an old friend standing beneath the shelter of a wooden awning, the kind that groans a little in the wind. There is no shout of greeting, no rushed movement. Instead, the friend steps forward slowly, eyes warm, lips curved in a small, knowing smile. No anger for time apart. No sharp words for the lateness of the meeting. Only kindness in the way the lantern is lifted higher to guide the traveller home. In that moment, the rain softens. The world seems to pause. And the traveller remembers a saying passed down to him long ago. Words spoken quietly beside another hearth, on another rainy night. A gentle word turns away wrath. He has carried those words through many places, but here, under the soft light of the lantern, he understands them more deeply. The friend reaches out, placing a steadying hand on his shoulder, and they walk together toward the little house. Inside, a kettle hums on the fire, and the aroma of tea fills the air. No questions are asked about the delays, the wrong turns, or the days lost along the way. Instead, the friend pours the tea, and they sit in silence, the only sound the clinking of cups and the steady rain tapping at the window. The traveller knows there is something powerful in this quiet welcome, something that can heal faster than anger, something that soothes without needing explanation. The warmth of the tea travels through his hands and into his chest, melting away the tension he had carried for so long. He understands now that sometimes the softest voice can be the strongest bridge, and that when tempers threaten to rise, one gentle word can save a friendship, a family, even a life. Outside, the lantern still glows in the mist, a small beacon against the night. It will be there for the next traveller too, offering the same light, the same welcome, and perhaps the same lesson, that kindness, spoken softly, has the power to guide even the most weary soul home. The rain has eased into a delicate drizzle, each droplet glistening like tiny beads upon the grass. The clouds above are a soft quilt of grey, and the air feels cool, damp, and alive. In the middle of a quiet meadow stands an ancient oak tree, its trunk wide enough that it would take 3 grown men with outstretched arms to encircle it. The bark is rough and weathered, marked by deep grooves that tell of decades, perhaps centuries, of wind, storms, and sunshine. Its branches stretch outward like strong arms, each one layered with leaves that shimmer faintly in the wet light. Beneath it, the ground is soft with fallen leaves, each one curled at the edges, carrying the scent of rain-soaked earth. Birds rest in its shelter, their small bodies tucked safely between the folds of branches. And somewhere high above, a squirrel darts across the canopy, moving as though this tree were an entire world in itself. A young woman approaches, her boots pressing gently into the wet grass. She has walked far, following a trail she barely remembers, until she found herself here, in the presence of the great oak. She pauses, tilts her head back, and lets her eyes trace the long journey of the tree from its deep, unseen roots to the farthest trembling leaf. In the stillness, she can almost hear the tree breathe, slow, steady, grounded. She remembers the words of her grandmother, spoken many years ago as they sat together on a wooden porch, shelling peas on a summer afternoon. Wisdom is like a tree. Its roots grow deep. At the time, she had nodded politely, too young to understand what those words truly meant. But here, standing before the oak, she begins to feel their truth. The roots of the tree are hidden, unseen, yet they hold the whole giant steady through storms, winds, and seasons. The deeper they grow, the more they anchor the oak, allowing it to stretch ever higher without fear of falling. She thinks of her own life, the trials she has faced, the mistakes she has made, and the lessons that seemed small at the time but grew into something stronger, something that steadied her when the world swayed. She reaches out to touch the bark, her fingertips tracing the rough patterns like reading an ancient script. Each groove, each scar, is part of the oak's story, not flaws, but marks of endurance. She wonders if people are the same, their experiences and hardships shaping them into something stronger, something more capable of sheltering others. A soft breeze stirs the leaves above, and they whisper to one another, their voices mingling with the gentle patter of rain. The young woman closes her eyes, letting the sound wash over her. She imagines the roots below, stretching deep into the earth, drinking from hidden waters that never run dry. Wisdom, she thinks, is not gathered quickly. It is drawn slowly, quietly, from the deep places within and around us. When she opens her eyes, she notices a small sapling growing not far from the oak, its thin stem trembling in the wind. It will be years before it reaches any great height, but already its roots are reaching down, learning the same secret the oak has always known: grow deep before you grow tall. She smiles, feeling a quiet kinship with the young tree. Then with a gentle nod to the oak, she turns to leave, her heart carrying the lesson forward. That true strength does not come from rushing upward into the world, but from grounding oneself deeply, firmly, and patiently in what truly matters. Behind her, the great oak stands as it always has, watching, sheltering, and silently teaching all who pause to listen. The morning begins shrouded in silver mist, the kind that blurs the edges of the world and softens every sound. The rain from the night before has left the air cool and heavy with the scent of wet stone and earth. A narrow river winds its way through the valley below, its waters moving steadily but without haste, glinting faintly beneath the pale light of the waking sun. A man stands on the bank, his boot sinking slightly into the damp soil. He is not young, but not yet old. The lines on his face speak of both laughter and long roads travelled. In his hand, he holds a walking stick worn smooth from years of use, and his gaze is fixed on the river. He has come here many mornings, drawn by something he cannot quite explain, something beyond the simple beauty of the place. He remembers the first time he found this river. It was years ago, when his life felt like an uphill climb with no summit in sight. He had been searching for answers, chasing opportunities, and pushing himself harder with every passing day. But instead of peace, all he found was exhaustion, a mind tangled in its own impatience. On that day, he had stood where he stands now, watching the water slip past. At first, he had been frustrated by its pace. Why did it not rush? Why did it not hurry to meet the ocean waiting for it miles away? But the longer he watched, the more he began to see the quiet wisdom in its movement. The river flowed with purpose, yet without urgency. It did not fight the bends in its path or the stones that blocked its way. It simply moved around them, certain that it would reach its destination in time. Today, as the man watches, the river carries small leaves and twigs from upstream, twirling them gently in eddies before releasing them back into the current. A heron stands knee-deep in the shallows, perfectly still, waiting for the right moment to strike. The ripples move outward from every drop that falls into the water, each one joining the greater rhythm without resistance. The man sits on a flat rock by the edge, leaning on his stick. He recalls an old saying he once heard from a fisherman he met in a distant village. Do not rush the river, it knows its own course. At the time, he had thought it was just a quaint piece of local wisdom, something said to pass the time while untangling nets. But now, with years behind him and more patience in his heart, he sees the truth in it. Life, he realizes, is much like this river. We are all carried forward by currents we cannot fully see or control. There are moments when the waters run swiftly and moments when they slow to a crawl, and each pace has its purpose. To fight against it is to exhaust oneself, to move with it is to find peace. A light drizzle begins again, dotting the surface of the water with tiny rings. The sound is soft, a soothing percussion that mingles with the low murmur of the current. The man takes a deep breath, feeling the cool air fill his lungs. He closes his eyes and listens, really listens, to the way the river speaks without words, teaching him that patience is not the absence of movement, but the trust that movement will come in its own time. When he finally stands to leave, the mist has begun to lift, revealing more of the valley beyond. The river glimmers brighter now, stretching away into the distance, winding toward places unseen. He knows it will get there, just as he will reach the places he is meant to be, not by forcing his way forward, but by letting the journey unfold as it should. As he walks back along the trail, the soft rush of the river follows him, a reminder that not all progress is visible. And not all paths need to be hurried. Somewhere far away, the ocean waits, and the river will arrive when it is ready. The evening sky is a tapestry of deep blues and soft purples, the last traces of sunlight fading into the horizon. A cool wind drifts across the hills, carrying with it the faint scent of wood smoke from distant cottages. In a small clearing, an old man kneels beside a lantern, his weathered hands cupping the glass as he strikes a match. The flame flickers, struggles for a moment against the wind, then steadies into a warm golden glow. Nearby, a small cottage sits quietly at the edge of the woods. Its roof is patched with moss, its shutters worn from years of seasons passing. Inside, a single room holds the modest belongings of someone who has learned to live simply. A wooden table, a few chairs, a small bed with a quilt sewn from the mismatched scraps of cloth. And on the table, there is a single candle, its wick unlit, waiting for the moment it will be called upon to break the darkness. The old man lifts the lantern carefully and carries it inside. His footsteps are slow, deliberate, as if honouring the light he brings. Setting the lantern down, he takes the candle into his hand and tilts it toward the flame. The wick catches instantly, blooming into a steady light that joins the lantern's warm circle of glow. In that quiet moment, he recalls words his mother once told him on a night very much like this. Better to light a candle than curse the darkness. She had said it without grandeur, simply and softly, as they sat together in a small kitchen during a winter storm, the power out, the wind rattling the windows. He had been young then, impatient, frustrated by the inconvenience, but she had smiled as she struck a match, as if she knew that the act of creating light was not just practical, it was an act of hope. Now, decades later, he understands her wisdom. The world holds many kinds of darkness, the kind that comes with nightfall, and the kind that seeps quietly into hearts. In either case, to curse it does nothing. To light a candle, however small, is to push back against it, to create a space where comfort can grow. The candle's flame dances gently, casting soft shadows on the walls. Outside, the wind still stirs, but it no longer feels as cold. The old man sits at the table, resting his hands around a steaming mug of tea. He knows that the candle cannot banish all the darkness outside his door, but it brightens the space he inhabits, and sometimes that is enough. Later that night, a traveller passes by the cottage, his path lit only by the faint glimmer of moonlight. He notices the candle glowing in the window, a small but steady beacon in the night. Drawn to it, he pauses at the door, hesitating for only a moment before knocking. The old man opens it with a smile and wordlessly gestures him inside. The traveller's cheeks are red from the wind, his coat damp from the mist. He sits gratefully by the fire while the old man pours him tea. The candle between them burns steadily, its light spilling across the table, warming not just the room, but something within both of them. No words are needed to explain its presence. It is simply there, a quiet answer to the night. As the hours pass, the traveller shares stories of faraway roads and distant towns. The old man listens, nodding, offering a few tales of his own. They speak softly, careful not to disturb the peace that the candlelight seems to protect. When the traveller finally rises to continue his journey, the old man takes the candle to the door, letting its glow guide the way back to the path. Long after the traveller has gone, the old man returns to his table. The candle is smaller now, its wax melted into a soft pool around the base, but the flame is still there, holding steady, as if it understands its purpose. The old man leans back, his eyes reflecting the gentle light. Somewhere deep inside, he feels his mother's words again, not as a memory, but as a living truth. The darkness outside remains vast, but within this little circle of light, it has no power. And so he lets the candle burn until its last flicker, content in the knowledge that even the smallest flame can be enough to guide someone home. The snow had been falling since before dawn, each flake drifting slowly from the heavy grey sky, as if the world had decided to move at half its usual speed. The fields and rooftops lay hidden beneath a thick unbroken blanket of white, and the air was hushed, the kind of silence that makes every sound seem sacred. Along the edge of a quiet forest, a narrow path wound its way toward a small village. It was barely visible now, buried beneath layers of snow, but the faint impression of footsteps marked its course. They were not fresh. The edges had begun to soften where the snowflakes had gathered, yet they still pointed forward, inviting anyone who found them to follow. A young man emerged from the trees, his breath a pale cloud in the cold air. He pulled his scarf higher around his face and looked down at the prints before him. They led in the same direction he had been planning to go, toward the cluster of cottages he could just make out in the distance. His own boots were heavy with snow, but he stepped into the existing tracks, finding the going easier where someone else had already broken the trail. As he walked, he thought about how these footprints had been made, the weight behind each step, the choice of direction, the quiet persistence it must have taken to keep moving through the cold. He imagined the person ahead of him, perhaps a villager carrying firewood, or a shepherd returning from the fields. Whoever it was, they had left behind a path for others to follow without even knowing it. The snow kept falling, soft and steady. The man's footsteps joined the others, weaving his journey into theirs. He thought of the words his father had once spoken to him when he was still a boy, struggling to make sense of a new life in an unfamiliar place. The path is made by walking. At the time, he had taken it to mean that he should simply keep moving forward. But now, with the cold biting at his cheeks and the trail stretching ahead, he saw the deeper meaning. Paths do not appear fully formed. They are made by the choices we take, one step after another, even when the way is unclear. And sometimes the act of walking does more than lead us somewhere. It leaves something behind for others, a guide through their own uncertain terrain. The man followed the trail out of the forest and into the open fields. Here, the snow was deeper, but the footprints remained, pressed into the whiteness like gentle instructions. He could see now that the tracks were not perfectly straight. They wandered slightly, curving around unseen dips in the land. This too felt like a lesson, that even when the path is not direct, it can still lead us where we need to go. Halfway to the village, the man came upon a low stone wall, its top dusted with snow. Resting on it for a moment, he looked back at the way he had come. His own steps now lay beside the earlier ones, doubling the strength of the trail. The wind had begun to pick up, brushing snow across the prints, but for now they remained. Proof that two people had crossed this place, each helping to keep the way clear for whoever might come next. He imagined a third traveller appearing later that day, weary and cold, finding the twin tracks and feeling the same quiet relief he had felt. The thought brought warmth to his chest. The path, he realised, was not just made by walking, it was kept alive by those who continued to walk it, even after the first person had passed through. By the time he reached the village, the snow had deepened and the light was beginning to fade. A warm glow spilled from the windows of the cottages, and the scent of wood smoke drifted through the air. He paused before stepping inside, glancing once more at the trail stretching back into the whiteness. Already, the snow was falling faster, softening the edges of the footprints, but he knew they would remain in some form. A trace of movement in the stillness. A reminder that the way forward is made by those willing to take the first step. And as he closed the door behind him, the snow continued to fall, covering the world in silence, ready for the next set of footsteps to carve their way through. The sun had only just begun to rise over the hills, casting a faint blush of gold along the edges of the sky. The fields were still wrapped in the pale light of dawn, and a low mist hovered over the grass like a soft veil. In the distance, the gentle bleating of sheep floated through the air, mingling with the quiet rustle of leaves stirred by the morning breeze. At the crest of a hill, a shepherd stood with his crook in hand, his silhouette outlined against the growing light. His coat was thick and worn from many seasons, the wool frayed in places where the wind had pulled at it. His boots sank slightly into the dew-soaked earth as he moved slowly, watching over the flock scattered across the slope below. He knew each sheep by sight, the older ones who lingered near the shade of the lone oak, the restless young ones who wandered too close to the edge of the pasture, and the stubborn ram who always seemed to test the boundaries. He had been tending this flock for years, long enough to understand that caring for them was not a task to be hurried. The sheep grazed at their own pace, drank from the stream when they pleased, and moved only when they felt ready. There were days, especially when storms threatened or the flock strayed too far, when impatience tempted him. It would be easier, perhaps, to shout, to drive them forward quickly and force the day along. But he had learned long ago that haste often led to mistakes, frightened sheep, broken formations, or worse, a lamb lost in the hills. And so he kept his pace slow, his voice calm, guiding them not with force, but with gentle persistence. As the sun rose higher, the mist began to lift, revealing the valley below in soft hues of green and gold. The shepherd leaned on his crook, remembering the words his grandfather had once told him while they sat together repairing a fence. Patience is the companion of wisdom. At the time, those words had felt like something distant, belonging to older men and slower lives. But now, as he watched the flock spread peacefully across the pasture, he understood them fully. Wisdom, he realised, was not simply knowing what to do, it was knowing when to do it, and having the patience to wait for the right moment. A shepherd who rushed the flock would wear them down, and a man who rushed through life would miss the quiet signs that guided him forward. Patience did not mean idleness. It meant choosing the right pace, even when the world seemed to press for more. A young lamb, curious and clumsy, began to wander toward a thicket at the edge of the pasture. The shepherd watched without alarm, his steps measured as he approached. He did not grab or startle the lamb. Instead, he stood nearby, blocking the way with the easy presence of someone who had been there many times before. The lamb turned back on its own, returning to the safety of the flock. The shepherd smiled faintly to himself, knowing that a hurried hand might have frightened the creature, making it bolt into the very danger he sought to prevent. The day passed in the rhythm he had come to cherish. The slow grazing, the occasional gathering of the flock when one strayed too far, the quiet breaks by the stream where he refilled his flask and watched the clouds drift lazily across the sky. The air carried the sweet scent of wildflowers mixed with the faint, earthy smell of the sheep's wool. As evening approached, the shepherd began the slow walk back toward the stone pen near his cottage. The flock followed in a loose line, their hooves pressing small prints into the soft earth. There was no rush, no sense of urgency. They moved together, steady and sure, the day winding down as gently as it had begun. When the last sheep was safely inside the pen, the shepherd closed the gate and leaned once more on his crook. The sun was dipping toward the horizon now, painting the clouds in warm streaks of orange and rose. He stood there for a moment, breathing in the cool air of twilight, and felt a deep, quiet satisfaction. Patience had carried him through the day, as it always did, guiding each decision, shaping each moment. He knew there would be more days like this, and perhaps days that tested him more harshly, but the lesson would remain the same. The flock would always move at its own pace, and wisdom would always walk hand in hand with patience. And as he turned toward the small light glowing in his cottage window, he felt the truth of it settle in his heart, steady and enduring as the hills themselves. The air inside the small room was still, touched only by the faint hum of the rain against the window. Outside, the world was muted under a veil of grey clouds, and the streets shone like polished stone, dark and glistening with the constant drizzle. Inside, the only light came from a single oil lamp on the table, its flames steady, casting a warm golden glow that softened the edges of the room. A man sat at that table, his hands wrapped loosely around a ceramic cup of tea that had long since cooled. His gaze was fixed not on the rain, but on the glass of water sitting before him. The water was perfectly still, the surface so smooth that it reflected the lamplight like a sheet of glass. It had been poured hours ago, untouched, yet it seemed to hold a quiet power, a small, unspoken reminder of something he couldn't quite name. His mind had been restless for weeks. Too many thoughts, too many decisions to make, too many voices from the outside world telling him what he should do, where he should go, who he should be. The noise of it all had followed him even into sleep, turning his dreams into an echo of the day's demands. But now, here in this room, there was no one else. No demands. Only the rain, the lamplight, and the still water in the cup. He remembered a time, many years ago, when he had sat by a river with an old friend. They had spoken little that afternoon, content instead to watch the way the current slowed in the shallows, how the sunlight played upon the ripples. When the man had asked his friend why they so often spent time in silence, the friend had smiled faintly and said, "Silence is a source of great strength." At the time, the words had felt strange. Strength was loud, wasn't it? Strength was a voice that rose above the noise, a force that demanded attention. But as he stared at the unmoving water now, he understood what his friend had meant. Silence did not shout. It did not push. It simply was, steady, unshaken, a deep well that could not be easily disturbed. He leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes, letting the sound of the rain wash over him. It was not silence in the truest sense. The rain had its own voice. But it was the kind of sound that wrapped itself around silence rather than breaking it. His breathing began to slow, the restless thoughts loosening their grip. He realised that the quiet wasn't empty at all. It was full of something deeper, something that had been waiting for him to notice. When he opened his eyes again, the water was still exactly as it had been. Yet somehow, it seemed different. It was no longer just a cup of water. It was a reflection of his own stillness, of the calm he felt returning to him. He reached out, lifted the cup, and took a slow sip. The coolness spread through him, grounding him further in the moment. The lamp flickered softly, the shadows on the walls shifting like gentle waves. Outside, the rain began to lighten, the drops smaller and farther apart, as if the world itself was taking a long, measured breath. He set the cup down and simply sat there, no longer feeling the need to fill the space with words or movement. He thought of how many times in his life he had rushed to fill silences, in conversations, in moments alone, even in his own thoughts. He had feared quiet because it seemed to demand something from him, some kind of action or distraction. But here, now, he saw that silence was not an absence, but a presence, and that within it was a strength that could steady him in ways nothing else could. The rain finally stopped, leaving only the faint drip of water from the eaves. The air felt different, lighter, clearer, and the man found himself smiling. He knew he could not hold on to this exact moment forever. The world outside would grow loud again, voices would return, and life would ask its endless questions. But he also knew that this stillness, this strength, would remain somewhere within him, waiting for the next time he chose to sit quietly and let it rise. He stood, carried the cup to the window, and looked out at the damp streets gleaming under the softened light of evening. The still water inside the cup caught the fading glow, and for a brief moment, he thought it looked like a small, captured piece of the sky. He placed it back on the table, letting it rest there, a reminder that in the midst of noise and haste, sometimes the most powerful thing one can do is simply be still. The night sky stretched wide and deep, a great canvas of indigo scattered with pinpricks of light. The air was crisp and cool, carrying the faint scent of pine from the forest nearby. Somewhere far off, the soft murmur of a stream wove its way through the silence. Above it all, high in the heavens, a single star shone brighter than the rest. Not the largest, not the most dazzling, but steady, unwavering, as though it had been placed there for a purpose. A boy sat on the grassy slope just outside his family's small farmhouse, his knees pulled to his chest and a woolen blanket draped around his shoulders. The hour was late, far later than his parents usually allowed him to be awake, but tonight was different. Tonight he was waiting. He remembered the old stories his grandmother used to tell by the fire, tales of travellers lost in dark forests, of sailors adrift at sea, of wanderers crossing endless deserts. In each story, when the path was gone and the night was thick, there would be a moment of despair, until someone would look up and see a star, small and far away, guiding them toward safety. She would always end the story the same way, leaning close and whispering, "Even the smallest star shines in the darkness." For years he had loved that line, though he never truly understood it. But now, as he sat outside on the quiet hillside, he felt the weight of those words in a new way. His family had been through a hard year, a failed harvest, a long winter, days that seemed to bring more worry than peace. Yet here he was, staring at a light so far away it might have burned for centuries before his eyes ever found it. And still it was here, shining. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the tall grass around him. He tightened the blanket and kept his gaze fixed on the little star. The other stars in the sky seemed to twinkle and fade as clouds passed, but this one held steady, as though it were determined to be seen. He thought about how easy it would be to miss it if he weren't looking. How many people went through their days without ever lifting their eyes to notice the small lights that kept them from feeling lost. He lay back on the grass, the cool earth beneath him grounding him in the present. Above, the star's faint glow seemed to grow sharper against the deepening blue. He imagined travellers long ago who might have followed it, not because it lit up the whole world, but because it gave them just enough light to take the next step. Maybe, he thought, that was the secret of such stars. They didn't erase the darkness, but they made it bearable. Somewhere inside the house, he heard the faint creak of the back door and the soft steps of his grandmother. She came to sit beside him, wrapping her own shawl tighter against the chill. For a while, they didn't speak. They simply watched the star together, the air between them filled with quiet understanding. After a time, she said softly, "You see it, don't you? That little one, right there." He nodded. "It doesn't look like much," she went on, her voice low and warm. "But it's been burning for longer than you or I can imagine. And no matter how dark it gets, it keeps shining. That's the thing about light. It doesn't need to be the biggest to make a difference." He felt her words settle inside him like a small ember, one he knew would stay with him for years. The night was vast, the world often uncertain, but somewhere out there, a small star always waited to be seen. They stayed until the cold began to bite at their cheeks, until the clouds finally drifted in to veil the sky. But even as they walked back to the warm glow of the farmhouse, the boy carried the image of the star with him, not as something far away, but as something inside him. And later, lying in bed with the sound of the wind against the windows, he understood at last that the smallest lights are often the ones we remember longest, because they shine when we need them most. The morning sun was soft and low, spilling golden light across the narrow lane that led to a weathered garden gate. Dew clung to the grass along the path, glistening like tiny jewels, and a light breeze carried the faint perfume of blossoms from somewhere beyond the fence. The gate itself was simple, wooden slats bound together with iron hinges that had rusted over time, yet it stood as though it guarded something precious. A young woman approached slowly, her steps unhurried, the hem of her skirt brushing against the damp grass. She had been walking for hours, following no particular road, until she came upon this quiet place. The sight of the gate stirred something in her. Curiosity, perhaps, or the sense that whatever lay beyond was meant to be discovered. She reached out, resting her palm on the wood. It was warm from the sun, textured with the grain of years gone by. With a gentle push, the gate opened inward, releasing a soft creak that blended with the rustle of leaves. The air beyond was different, richer somehow, and alive with a calm she hadn't realised she'd been searching for. The garden unfolded before her in a riot of colour and life. Rows of lavender swayed in the breeze, their purple blooms humming with the busy dance of bees. A tall rosebush leaned gracefully over a winding stone path, its petals scattered like confetti along the ground. In the far corner, a small apple tree bent under the weight of ripening fruit, its branches reaching toward the earth in a slow, generous offering. She wandered in, following the path, her fingertips grazing the flowers as she passed. Each step seemed to lighten her thoughts, loosening the knots she'd been carrying for days. There was something in the way the garden seemed to hold itself, tended with care, yet free enough to grow wild in places. It spoke of patience and kindness, of a hand that had guided rather than forced. Near the centre, she found a wooden bench beneath the shade of a great willow. Sitting there, she closed her eyes and let the sounds of the garden surround her. The gentle buzz of insects, the soft cooing of a dove somewhere above, the faint trickle of water from a hidden fountain. It felt as if the whole place was breathing in time with her, inviting her to simply be. She thought then of a saying she had once heard, though she couldn't remember where. He who plants kindness gathers love. At the time, it had felt like one of those pleasant phrases people repeat without much thought. But now, sitting in this living tapestry, she could see its truth everywhere she looked. Every flower, every piece of fruit, every shaded corner seemed like the result of countless small acts of care. Seeds planted, soil tended, weeds removed, all with no expectation other than to help something grow. She imagined the gardener, who must have worked here over the years. Perhaps they had knelt in the early morning to plant these rows, hands deep in the soil, their mind already picturing the blossoms that would one day appear. Perhaps they had carried water in the heat of summer, pruning gently where needed, protecting the tender shoots from frost in winter. None of it for recognition, none of it for applause, simply for the joy of nurturing life. As she sat, she realised that kindness was much the same. Each small act might seem insignificant at first. A soft word, a shared meal, a patient smile. But over time, those moments could grow into something beautiful, something that offered shelter and nourishment to others in ways one might never see. A soft thump drew her attention, and she turned to see a ripe apple rolling gently across the grass. She picked it up, its skin warm from the sun, and took a slow bite. The flavour was sweet, with a hint of tartness, and as she chewed, she felt the truth of the proverb even more deeply. This fruit was the result of a kindness planted long ago, long before she had ever walked through that gate. The breeze stirred again, carrying the scent of lavender and roses toward her. She leaned back on the bench, letting the peace of the garden settle around her. She knew she could not stay here forever, but she also knew she would carry this feeling with her. The reminder that what we plant, whether in the earth or in the hearts of others, has the power to grow into something lasting. When she finally rose to leave, she paused at the gate, looking back one last time. The garden glowed in the morning light, alive with quiet generosity. She smiled, her heart lighter, and stepped back onto the lane, already thinking of the seeds she herself might plant in the days to come. The valley lay in the quiet embrace of winter. its slopes covered in a patchwork of snow and frost. A pale sun hovered low in the skills, casting a faint, silvery light over the land. From a distance, the river that wound through the valley looked frozen, though here and there the water still flowed beneath a thin skin of ice, whispering softly as it moved. Stretching from one side of the valley to the other was a bridge, old, sturdy, and worn smooth by decades of footsteps. Its wooden planks were weathered to a soft grey, and its railings, though leaning slightly, still stood firm against the cold winds. Moss clung to its edges, and on the underside icicles formed like rows of glass teeth, catching the light when the sun broke through the clouds. On one side of the bridge, a small village clustered around a church steeple. Smoke curled lazily from chimneys, and the faint smell of baking bread drifted across the snow. On the other side, the road wound away into the hills, disappearing into a world that seemed distant and unknown. The bridge connected these two places, joining the familiar with the uncertain, the home with the journey. It was here, on this bridge, that two figures approached from opposite ends. The first was a traveller, a man wrapped in a thick coat, a scarf pulled high over his face, and a pack slung over his shoulder. His steps were careful, the snow crunching beneath his boots. The second was a woman from the village, carrying a basket tucked under her arm. She was returning from delivering food to an elderly neighbour on the far side of the valley. They met in the middle, pausing briefly to greet one another. The wind lifted strands of the woman's hair, and the man's breath clouded in the air between them. She offered him a small smile and a quiet, safe travels, and he nodded, thanking her before continuing on. Their exchange lasted no more than a moment, yet it warmed the space between them more than the winter sun could. As the traveller walked on, he thought about the meeting. He did not know her name, and she would likely not remember his face, yet for that brief time on the bridge, their paths had crossed in kindness. He recalled a proverb he had heard once from an old seafarer in a distant port. One kind word can warm 3 winter months. It had sounded poetic then, but now, with the cold wind biting at his cheeks, he felt the truth of it. The bridge seemed to carry that truth in its timbers. Over the years, it had seen countless meetings, neighbours stopping to share news, lovers exchanging promises, merchants offering goods to strangers. In the heart of winter, when the snow lay deep and the roads were hard to travel, the bridge became more than a way across the valley. It became a place where warmth was passed from one soul to another, carried in words, in smiles, in small acts of generosity. The woman, now nearing her village, glanced back once. She saw the traveller moving steadily toward the far road, his figure growing smaller against the white hills. She could not say why, but she hoped he carried her words with him, as she carried his quiet gratitude in return. The thought eased the chill in her fingers, made her basket feel a little lighter. Snow began to fall, drifting down in soft, lazy flakes. The bridge took on a dusting of white, the planks whispering faintly under the touch of each snowflake. In time, the prints of the two travellers would fade, and no one would know they had met there at all. But the warmth exchanged would remain, invisible but real, like the lingering heat of a fire long after the flames have gone out. Far above, the pale sun sank lower, turning the snow to a wash of silver. The bridge stood as it always had, ready for the next crossing, ready for the next pair of travellers whose lives might touch for only a moment, yet leave each carrying a little more warmth than before. And in that way, through countless brief and gentle encounters, the Winter Valley was never truly cold. The morning broke with a thin veil of mist lying low over the meadows, the kind that softened every edge and blurred the line between earth and sky. A faint gold light began to seep into the air as the sun rose, scattering across the grass still damp with dew. Somewhere beyond the hedgerows, a bird began to sing, not loudly, but with a sweetness that seemed to draw the world closer, as though every leaf leaned in to listen. Perched on a slender branch near the edge of a quiet lane, a sparrow fluffed its feathers against the lingering cool of dawn. Its body was small, its wings no wider than a man's hand, yet its song filled the stillness with a warmth that reached far beyond its size. Each note rose and fell like the gentle lilt of a lullaby, carrying a kind of simple joy that needed no explanation. A man walking the lane slowed his steps when he heard it. He had been moving quickly, his mind full of the day ahead, lists of tasks, numbers to remember, errands to run, but the sound of the sparrow's voice made him pause. He tilted his head, scanning the hedgerow until he spotted the little bird among the tangle of leaves. For a long moment, he simply stood there, listening. There was something about the sparrow's song that seemed untouched by worry or want. It sang because it could, because the day was here, because the sun had risen again. The man thought of a proverb his mother used to say when life felt difficult. Gratitude turns what we have into enough. At the time, he had only nodded, not quite grasping the depth of it. But here, listening to the sparrow, he felt those words settle into place. The bird was not waiting for the perfect branch or a brighter day. It was not singing because it had been given something new. It was singing simply for what already was. The shelter of the hedge, the taste of morning air, the warmth of the coming sun. The man let out a slow breath, his shoulders relaxing as if he had been holding them tense without realizing it. He thought about his own life, how often he measured his days by what he lacked instead of what was already there. He had a roof over his head, food in his kitchen, people who cared for him, and a body able to carry him through the world. Perhaps, he thought, these things were not just enough. Perhaps they were everything. The sparrow shifted slightly on its branch, tilting its head as though noticing him for the first time. Its song softened, but did not stop. The man smiled, almost shyly, and gave a small nod in return, as though the bird might understand his thanks. He continued down the lane, but his steps were slower now, each one unhurried. The sound of the sparrow's song followed him for a while, fading gently as he moved farther away, until it became part of the greater hush of the countryside. As he walked, he began to notice other things. The way the sunlight touched the tops of the hedges, turning each droplet of dew into a shard of crystal. The faint hum of bees already at work in the wildflowers, the smell of fresh bread drifting faintly from a cottage somewhere nearby. None of these were new, but they felt newly seen, newly appreciated. By the time he reached the village square, the day had fully arrived. The air was warmer, the mist lifting to reveal the distant hills. He greeted the baker with a smile, nodded to the farmer unloading crates of vegetables, and realised that something in him had shifted. The long list of tasks in his mind no longer felt heavy. They were simply part of the day, to be done in their own time. And though he could not hear it anymore, he carried the sparrow's song with him. Not the sound itself, but the feeling it had left behind. A reminder that enough was not a measure of quantity, but of gratitude. That sometimes the smallest voices could sing the loudest truths. The air was cool with the freshness of early morning, the kind of air that seemed to wake the skin as much as the mind. A pale mist hung low over the land, and beyond it, the faint outline of a path wound its way toward distant hills. Each stone along the trail was slick with dew, glistening faintly in the weak light of dawn. Somewhere, unseen but near, a brook babbled over smooth rocks, its voice blending with the occasional trill of a waking bird. A young traveller stood at the edge of that path, a worn leather satchel slung over one shoulder. His boots were scuffed from many miles, though they had yet to touch this particular road. He had heard about it from an old farmer at a market days before. A way through the hills that would lead to a town he had never seen. It was not the easiest route, the farmer had said, but it was the most beautiful. And those who walked it always carried the memory with them. The traveller took a deep breath and stepped forward. The path was narrow at first, bordered by tall grass heavy with dew. Each step left a faint dark mark in the green, soon to be erased by the warming sun. He felt the earth steady beneath his feet, each movement grounding him more firmly in the journey. As the path curved, the land opened into a meadow sprinkled with wildflowers, pale blues, soft yellows, and tiny white blossoms that seemed to shimmer in the light. Bees drifted lazily from flower to flower, and the air was filled with their gentle hum. The traveller slowed, taking it all in. He had once been told by his grandmother, "A journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step." The words had sounded simple when he was younger, almost obvious. But now, walking through the meadow, he felt the weight and truth of them. He thought back to the months before this journey began. There had been hesitation, doubt, even fear. The idea of travelling so far had seemed overwhelming, as though the miles ahead were too many to even begin. But here he was, and each step he took proved that distance was not conquered all at once, but one small movement at a time. The path began to rise, winding gently upward into the hills. The air grew cooler, carrying the scent of pine from the dark green forest ahead. The traveller's breath came faster, and his legs ached slightly, but he kept going. The sound of the brook returned, now louder, its water rushing downhill beside the trail. He stopped for a moment to kneel and cup his hands into the stream. The water was cold and clear, and as he drank, he felt it refresh not just his body, but something deeper inside, a quiet resolve to keep moving. Further along, the trail narrowed again, hemmed in by high rock walls on either side. Moss clung to the stones, and small ferns sprouted from cracks in the rock. It would have been easy to feel enclosed here, but instead he felt safe, guided forward by the natural walls that seemed to say, "You are on the right path." Hours passed, and the traveller reached a ridge where the land fell away into a valley below. From here, he could see fields stretching far into the distance, dotted with cottages and winding roads. The town he sought was still far away, its spire just a faint mark against the horizon. And yet, looking at it from this height, he did not feel daunted. Each mile between him and that spire was not an obstacle, but a series of steps, each one an act of choosing to continue. He sat on a flat rock at the ridge's edge, eating bread from his satchel and letting the wind brush against his face. He realised that the first step he had taken that morning had been more than just the start of this road. It had been a promise to himself, a quiet agreement that he would keep moving, no matter how far the way stretched ahead. When he rose again, the sun was higher, warming the stones beneath his boots. He started down into the valley, each step light and sure. The town might still be hours away, but he was already on his way there, and that was enough. The journey, he thought, was never about how fast one moved or how quickly the end was reached. It was about the decision to take that first step, and then another, and another, until, without even realising it, the miles had become memories, and the road had become a story he would carry forever. The afternoon light spilled gently through the small cottage windows, falling in golden patches across the worn wooden floor. Outside, the world was quiet, except for the soft sigh of the wind in the trees, and the occasional creak of branches shifting in the breeze. The air inside the cottage was warm, carrying the faint scent of dried herbs that hung in bundles from the rafters. In the corner, a small fire burned steadily in the hearth, its flames low but constant, giving off a slow, steady heat. An old armchair sat beside the fire, the fabric faded from years of use, but shaped perfectly to the body that had settled into it countless times. In that chair now sat a woman, her knitting resting in her lap. She wasn't working on it. Her hands were still, her eyes half closed. She was simply sitting, letting the sound of the fire and the rhythm of her own breathing fill the space. It had taken her many years to learn the value of this kind of peace. Once, her life had been filled with constant expectation, the expectation to be busy, to be productive, to meet the demands of others before her own. She had hurried through her days, measuring their worth by how much she had accomplished. And yet, no matter how much she did, there had always been more to do, more to prove. One evening, many winters ago, she had sat here in the same chair, feeling as though she was being pulled in too many directions. She had been knitting then too, her fingers moving quickly, her mind elsewhere. The fire had been burning low, and she had gotten up to add another log. As she crouched to place it in the flames, she had stopped suddenly, noticing the way the embers glowed softly beneath the wood, alive and warm without needing anything from her. It had struck her, in that quiet moment, that not everything needed to be stoked into constant flame. Some things, like the embers, could be left to burn gently on their own. She had thought then of a line her grandfather used to say, "Peace begins where expectation ends." At the time, it had felt like a puzzle she couldn't solve, but in that moment by the fire, it had made sense. So much of her restlessness came from trying to meet expectations, both her own and those set by others. Letting go of them, even briefly, was like putting down a heavy bundle she had been carrying for too long. Now, years later, she lived by that lesson. She still tended her garden, cooked her meals, and helped her neighbours when they needed her. But she no longer measured the worth of her days by how much she did. Sometimes, as now, the most valuable thing she could give herself was the gift of stillness. The fire shifted softly, a log settling deeper into the grate. She opened her eyes fully and watched the small flames curl upward, dancing in their own unhurried way. Outside, The wind carried the faint rattle of dry leaves along the path, but the sound only added to the feeling of being tucked away from the world. She leaned back into the chair, her body fitting into its familiar shape. The knitting still lay in her lap, and she picked it up, but this time she moved the needle slowly, letting the yarn slip through her fingers without any rush. Each stitch was its own small act of care, not a task to be finished, but a quiet rhythm to be enjoyed. The cottage smelled faintly of rosemary and wood smoke, and as the minutes stretched on, she felt the warmth from the hearth sinking into her bones. She realised she could sit here all evening, without the need to answer to anything or anyone. The world outside would continue as it always did. The sun would set, the moon would rise, the stars would shine, and she would still be here, safe in her chair, wrapped in the kind of peace that came not from achieving more, but from wanting less. Eventually, she set the knitting aside and let her hands rest once more. The fire crackled gently, the wind whispered against the walls, and the old truth returned to her like an old friend. Peace is not something that arrives with the end of work, but something that appears the moment you stop asking for more than what is here. And with that, she closed her eyes again, letting the warmth and stillness carry her into the quiet heart of the evening. The afternoon sky had taken on the muted colours of late autumn, soft greys and pale golds, as though the sun was wrapped in a sheer veil. A breeze whispered through the trees, carrying with it the crisp scent of fallen leaves. They littered the ground in shades of amber, rust, and deep crimson, forming a carpet that crunched gently underfoot. Somewhere in the distance, a crow called once, its voice echoing faintly in the quiet. On the edge of the forest, a woman walked slowly along a narrow path. Her coat was buttoned against the chill, and her scarf fluttered lightly in the wind. She kept her gaze low, watching the leaves swirl and tumble ahead of her, like dancers without a leader, moving wherever the air decided to take them. Every so often, she stopped to watch one fall from a branch above, spiraling softly down until it joined the others on the ground. There was something in the way the leaves let go that stirred something deep inside her. They did not resist. They did not cling to the branch in fear of the change. When it was time, they released themselves into the air, trusting the wind to carry them where they needed to be. Her steps slowed as she remembered a line her father had once told her after a particularly hard year. Accept what is, let go of what was, and have faith in what will be. She had nodded then, too tired to think much about it. But now, surrounded by these quiet examples of letting go, she felt the truth of his words in a way she hadn't before. She had been holding on to so much lately. Old disappointments, conversations she wished had gone differently, plans that had crumbled before they even began. These things clung to her like a second skin, making every step forward feel heavier than it should. And yet, here were the trees, standing tall and untroubled, even as they shared what had once been part of them. The wind picked up, swirling a cluster of leaves into the air. They danced in a golden whirl before scattering in all directions. She imagined them as little pieces of the past, moments released without regret, free to rest wherever they landed. She stopped beside a tall maple whose branches were nearly bare. One last leaf clung stubbornly to a high branch, trembling in the breeze. She found herself watching it closely, almost holding her breath. For a long moment, it stayed in place. Then, with a small shift of the wind, it loosened, drifted down in slow circles, and came to rest at her feet. She bent to pick it up. The leaf was delicate, its edges curled inward, its veins like fine lines on an old hand. She turned it over in her fingers, feeling the smooth, dry surface. It was beautiful, even in its final stage. Proof that letting go didn't mean losing value. The thought made her smile faintly. She slipped the leaf into her coat pocket, not as something to cling to, but as a reminder. A reminder that change was not the end, but a step in a cycle that had been turning for longer than she could imagine. As she walked on, the path began to widen, leading out of the trees and into a meadow where the grass bent gently in the wind. The sky was opening now, the sun peeking through in thin rays that caught on the edges of the remaining leaves, turning them into little sparks of gold. She tilted her face toward the light, feeling its warmth against her skin. For the first time in a long while, she didn't think about the things she wished she could change. She didn't replay old words or try to hold on to what was gone. Instead, she let her thoughts drift with the wind, like the leaves that had already found their way to the ground. In the quiet, she felt something she hadn't felt in weeks. A sense of ease, as if she had been carrying a heavy bag and had finally set it down. The world, she realised, would keep moving forward whether she held on or not. And maybe, just maybe, she could trust herself to move with it. She reached the far side of the meadow and glanced back once at the forest. The trees stood tall, their branches bare against the pale sky, yet they looked anything but empty. They looked ready for the rest the winter would bring, ready for the green that would one day return. With a small breath, she turned and continued on her way, her hands tucked in her pockets, her fingers brushing against the leaf. Somewhere deep inside, the quiet lesson of the falling leaves had taken root, and she carried it with her like a gentle promise. When the time comes, you will be able to let go. The workshop was small, tucked at the edge of the village, with walls made of old timber that smelled faintly of sawdust and smoke. Light streamed in through a single window, its glass wavy with age, casting uneven patches of gold across the floor. The air inside was warm, heavy with the scent of wet clay and the faint mineral tang of drying pottery. In the centre of the room sat a wooden wheel, worn smooth from years of use, and beside it a wide basin of water that reflected the afternoon sun in soft ripples. An elderly potter stood at the wheel, sleeves rolled up to his elbows, hands coated in a thin layer of grey clay. His touch was gentle yet sure, guiding the lump of earth on the wheel as it spun in a slow, steady rhythm. The soft hum of the turning wheel was like a heartbeat in the quiet space, accompanied only by the occasional creak of wood and the patter of water dripping back into the basin. He worked slowly, not because he lacked skill, but because he understood that clay could not be hurried. Too much force, and the walls of the pot would collapse. Too little attention, and it would grow uneven. His hands pressed and released with the ease of one who had shaped hundreds of vessels before, each one unique, each one holding its own quiet story. A young boy stood in the doorway, watching. He had passed the workshop many times, always curious about the shapes that seemed to appear out of nothing beneath the potter's hands. Today, he had gathered enough courage to step inside. The potter glanced up, his eyes warm beneath his furrowed brow. "Come closer," he said, nodding toward the wheel. "Watch carefully." The boy stepped forward, his gaze fixed on the clay as it rose beneath the potter's touch, transforming from a shapeless lump into something tall and symmetrical. "How do you know what it will be?" he asked softly. The potter smiled without looking up. "I don't always. Sometimes I start with a plan, and sometimes the clay tells me what it wants to become. But either way, it is the space inside that gives it purpose." The boy frowned slightly, not understanding. The potter dipped his hands into the basin, letting the water run over his fingers before shaping the clay again. "You see," he continued, "we shape clay into a pot, but it is the emptiness inside that holds. Without that space, it cannot carry water or grain or flowers. The outside matters, but the inside, the emptiness, is what makes it useful." The boy thought about that for a moment, watching as the pot took form under the potter's steady hands. It seemed strange that something could be valuable because of what it didn't have, because of a space where nothing was. The potter slowed the wheel and leaned back, letting the shape settle. "It is the same with people, so," he said quietly. "We spend so much time thinking about what we can fill ourselves with, knowledge, possessions, titles, but sometimes it is the space we keep within us that matters most. The space for kindness, for patience, for listening. If we are too full of ourselves, there is no room for anything else to come in." The boy nodded slowly, beginning to see the truth in the words. The potter lifted the pot carefully from the wheel and placed it on a shelf beside several others. Some were finished and glazed, gleaming in the sunlight, while others were still drying, their surfaces soft to the touch. Each one had its own shape, its own imperfections, yet each was ready to hold something, ready to serve a purpose because of the emptiness within. "Would you like to try?" the potter asked. The boy's eyes widened. "Me? Why not? Everyone should know what it feels like to shape something with their own hands." The boy stepped up to the wheel, the wood cool beneath his palms. The potter placed a fresh mound of clay before him and began to turn the wheel slowly. "Wet your hands," he instructed, and the boy obeyed, feeling the cold water coat his skin. "Now, press gently. Not too hard, not too soft." The boy tried, but the clay wobbled and threatened to collapse. He laughed nervously, but the potter only smiled. "It takes time. Don't force it. Let it find its own balance." Bit by bit, under the potter's guidance, the clay began to take shape. It wasn't perfect. The walls leaned slightly, and the rim dipped on one side. But it was something. The boy felt a quiet pride as he looked at it. "It's not bad," the potter said, "and it has room inside. That's the most important part." The boy grinned, wiping his hands on the apron the potter had given him. As he left the workshop, the late afternoon light spilling across the path, he kept thinking about the strange truth he had learned, that sometimes it is not what you add, but what you leave open, that makes something, or someone, truly whole. The lighthouse stood on the far edge of the rocky cliff, its white walls streaked with years of wind and salt. From the village below, it seemed almost part of the stone itself, rising out of the earth like a steadfast sentinel. The ocean stretched endlessly beyond it, a restless sweep of deep blues and shifting greys. the waves rolling in with the slow, powerful rhythm of something that had no beginning and no end. Inside the lighthouse, the air smelled faintly of oil and salt water. The spiral staircase wound upward in tight circles, each step creaking underfoot. At the very top, where the glass dome opened to the horizon, an old man tended the great lamp. His back was bent from years of climbing those stairs, but his movements were precise, deliberate. Every evening, just before the light was needed, he polished the glass and checked the mechanisms, making sure everything was ready to cut through the dark. It was quiet work, and often lonely. He had been the keeper here for decades, long after most others would have chosen an easier life. He had seen tempests that shook the cliff to its bones, nights so dark the sea seemed to vanish, and mornings when the horizon burned gold with the rising sun. Through it all, his task had been the same: to keep the light burning, to guide those who could not see the shore. One evening, as he trimmed the wick and set the lamp aglow, he thought of a proverb his father had told him when he was young. When you light a lamp for someone, it also brightens your path. He had heard it many times before, but tonight, with the wind howling outside and the sea restless below, the words settled differently in his mind. He had always believed his work was for the sailors, for the fishing boats returning late, for the strangers passing through these waters. And it was, but it was also for himself. In lighting the way for others, he had given his own life direction, a rhythm that shaped his days and anchored his purpose. The storm came in quickly that night. Clouds gathered thick over the moon, and the waves began to hurl themselves against the cliff with furious force. Rain struck the glass of the lantern room, blurring the view, but the light shone steadily, cutting through the storm like a golden thread. The old man stood by it, watching as its beams swept across the black waters. Far out at sea, a fishing boat struggled against the swell. Its crew, soaked to the skin and fighting the wind, spotted the beam slicing through the rain. It was faint at first, a flicker in the distance, but it grew stronger, steadier, guiding them towards safety. Without that light, they might have wandered in circles or drifted too close to the rocks hidden beneath the waves. Hours later, when the storm had passed and the sea began to calm, the old man made his way down the stairs to the narrow path that wound along the cliff to the village. At the dock, the fishing boat was tied fast, its crew unloading their catch. One of the men spotted him and called out, lifting a hand in gratitude. The old man nodded in return, a small smile touching his weathered face. Walking back toward the lighthouse, he felt the truth of his father's words warming him from the inside. In offering light to others, he had lit his own way. Not the path down the cliff or through the village, but the path of his life. Each evening he had climbed those steps. Each night he had kept the flame alive. He had been following that path without even realizing it. The next morning, the sea lay calm under a pale sky. The lighthouse stood silent, waiting for night to fall again. The old man sat on a bench outside, sipping tea and listening to the gulls cry overhead. He knew the storm would come again someday, perhaps tomorrow, perhaps weeks from now, and when it did, the lamp would be ready. And so would he, because lighting the way for others had never been just about them. It had always been about the quiet joy that came from knowing that, in some small way, His light reached both outward and inward, guiding others home while keeping his own heart steady in the vast, unpredictable sea of life. The hills were quiet in the early morning, the air cool and damp with the lingering scent of night. Mist clung low to the ground, curling around the roots of trees and drifting lazily across the narrow dirt path that wound between them. The only sound was the gentle crunch of footsteps as a traveller made his way down into the valley. He had been walking for days, moving steadily toward a destination he could not yet see. His pack was light, containing only what he truly needed: a small blanket, a loaf of bread, a flask of water, and a worn leather journal tucked into the side pocket. The road had taken him through mountains, across fields and into deep forests, but here the path sloped downward into a place that felt different, almost hidden. The sound of water reached him before he saw it, a faint, steady murmur that grew louder with each step. He rounded a bend, and there, at the base of a small rocky hill, a clear spring bubbled from the earth. The water spilled into a shallow pool before trickling into a narrow stream that wandered off into the trees. The traveller paused, taking in the sight. There was no grand sign to mark the place, no carved stone or wooden bridge, just the quiet generosity of the earth offering its water. He knelt beside the pool and dipped his hands into it. The water was cold, pure, and when he drank, it seemed to wash the dust of the road from more than just his throat. He sat back, watching the way the water flowed. It didn't rush or force its way forwards. It simply moved, winding along the path it had carved for itself over countless years. And yet, for all its humility, the stream would one day join the river that cut through the valley, and the river would find its way to the sea. A phrase came to him then, something he had heard long ago from a wandering teacher who had passed through his village. All streams flow to the sea because it is lower than they are. At the time, he had thought it strange. Why would something so vast and powerful as the sea be described in terms of its lowliness? But here, watching the stream slip quietly away, he began to understand. The sea did not demand that the water come to it. It waited, patient and still, knowing that in lowering itself, in being willing to receive rather than claim, it could gather the strength of all the rivers and streams in the world. He thought about the people he had met along the road. There were those who always needed to be first, to be highest, to stand above others. And there were those who listened more than they spoke, who gave more than they took, who let others be seen before themselves. It was always the latter who seemed most at peace, and like the sea, most full. The traveller lingered at the spring for a long time, eating a little bread and writing a few lines in his journal. He wrote of the way the water's surface trembled where it emerged from the earth, of the way it spread into ripples when a leaf fell onto it, of the way it moved without resistance, yet still reached its destination. When he finally stood to leave, he filled his flask with the cold water, knowing it would serve him well on the miles ahead. As he walked away, he glanced back once more at the pool, its surface catching a sliver of sunlight breaking through the trees. It looked so small, so quiet, and yet it was part of something far greater. The path carried him deeper into the valley, and soon he was walking alongside the stream itself. It curved and bent, disappearing at times into the undergrowth, only to return again, always moving forward. He found himself matching its pace. unhurried yet steady, and the more he walked with it, the more he felt the weight in his chest ease. By the time the sun was high and the stream had joined a wider river, the traveller understood the truth hidden in the old words. To be like the sea was not to be weak, but to be strong enough to lower oneself so that others might flow toward you freely. And in doing so, you become vast, wide enough to hold the journeys of many, deep enough to carry them onward. The river's voice grew louder now, its current stronger, and somewhere far beyond his sight, the sea was waiting. The morning was bright and full of the gentle warmth that comes only after a long stretch of rainy days. Sunlight spilled through the open window of a small kitchen, laying golden squares across the wooden table where a plate of fresh bread cooled. The air carried the scent of yeast and butter, and from outside came the sound of laughter, light, unrestrained and pure. In the garden just beyond the door, a child was running barefoot across the grass. His small feet left damp prints where the dew had not yet lifted, and his hair gleamed in the sun like fine strands of copper. He darted between rows of flowers, his arms outstretched as if he might take flight at any moment. Every few steps, he stopped to examine something. A ladybug inching along a leaf, a cloud shaped like a ship, a feather lying soft against the ground. The old woman sitting on the porch watched him with quiet amusement. She had lived in this house for nearly all her life, and the garden was her pride, carefully tended season after season. Yet she had never explored it the way the boy did now, as though every bloom, every stone, and every blade of grass held a secret waiting to be uncovered. She remembered a saying her mother had once shared with her on a day when she was still young enough to run without tiring. To the child, every day is a new adventure. At the time she had smiled and agreed, but she hadn't really understood it. Now, as she watched the boy crouch to peer at the way sunlight caught the wings of a dragonfly, she felt the truth of it in her bones. The child's joy wasn't tied to grand events or faraway journeys. He didn't need a reason to be excited. The world itself was enough. A patch of clover could hold his attention for minutes at a time. A sudden gust of wind could make him burst into delighted giggles. He moved through the garden with no thought for what came next, only for what was before him in that moment. The woman found herself leaning forward, wanting to see what he saw. When he pointed to a cluster of daisies and called her over, she stepped carefully across the grass and knelt beside him. The flowers were simple, their white petals curling gently around golden centres, yet the boy looked at them as though they were rare jewels. He reached out a small hand, but stopped just short of touching them, his voice lowering to a whisper, as if not to disturb them. In that moment, the woman realised how easily she had walked past these same flowers every day without a second glance. They were always there, part of the background. But to the boy, they were new, not because they had just bloomed, but because he had just found them. They spent the morning like that, wandering from one corner of the garden to the other, discovering things she had stopped noticing long ago. A snail slowly making its way across a stone. The faint, sweet scent of honeysuckle when the breeze shifted. The way the clouds changed shape if you lay in the grass and watched them long enough. As the sun rose higher, they sat together on the porch steps, the boy munching happily on a piece of bread while she sipped her tea. She felt lighter somehow, as though she had been walking with a heavy coat on and had only just now taken it off. The child had shown her something she had forgotten, That adventure wasn't something to chase. It was something to notice. Later, when the boy wandered off to play with a stick he had decided it was a pirate's sword, she thought about the way adults often spoke of longing for excitement, for change, for something big enough to make them feel alive again. Yet here was this child, finding that feeling in a droplet of water sliding down a petal. She made a quiet promise to herself then to look at the world more often with a child's eyes, to let each day hold something worth discovering, no matter how small. And perhaps, she thought with a smile, to leave her shoes behind now and then, and feel the cool grass beneath her feet. From the garden came another burst of laughter, bright as sunlight. The old woman closed her eyes for a moment, letting the sound settle in her heart like a gift she hadn't known she needed. And when she opened them again, the world looked just a little newer. The mountain path began where the last cluster of houses ended, winding upward in a series of uneven stone steps carved long ago. From the village below, it looked almost like a ribbon laid across the slope, vanishing and reappearing between ridges and stands of tall, wind-bent pines. The air here was cooler, carrying the clean scent of rock, moss, and the faint sweetness of alpine flowers that clung stubbornly to cracks in the stone. A lone traveller stood at the start of the path, leaning on a sturdy walking stick. His pack was light, though not by choice. The climb would be long, and every ounce mattered. He took a deep breath, feeling the coolness in his lungs, and began to walk. The first steps were easy enough, the slope gentle, the stones dry beneath his boots. But as the minutes passed, the ground grew steeper, and the path twisted sharply, forcing him to slow. He had heard about this trail from a shepherd in the village, who had warned him, "The mountain is not to be conquered, let it guide you." At first the words had puzzled him. He thought of mountains as challenges to be overcome, something to reach the top of as quickly as possible, to stand above and look down upon. But now, as the path narrowed and the air thinned, he began to feel the weight of the advice. The mountain didn't care about his pace or his determination. It had stood here for centuries before him and would stand for centuries after. The path was not a straight line to the top, but a winding journey, full of detours that seemed at first to lead away from his goal. At one point, the trail dipped into a shaded hollow where the air was damp and cool. A small stream crossed his way, trickling over smooth stones, and he paused to drink, feeling the water renew him. If he had rushed forward, intent only on the summit, he might have missed it. As the climb continued, the wind began to pick up, tugging at his clothes and carrying with it a low, constant hum that seemed to come from the very bones of the mountain. The higher he went, the more the world below faded into a soft haze, the village now just a scattering of shapes, the fields like pale green patches stitched into the earth. He realised that the path was shaping him as much as it was carrying him upward, forcing him to adapt to its pace, to its turns, to its moments of stillness. At a sharp bend, he came upon a wide ledge overlooking a deep valley. He sat on a flat rock, letting his legs rest, and took out a small piece of bread from his pack. From here, he could see where the path continued, not straight toward the peak, but curving along the side of the mountain before disappearing again into the folds of stone. It struck him that the mountain seemed less interested in giving him the shortest route than in showing him what lay along the way. In the distance, a hawk wheeled lazily in the air, rising and falling on invisible currents. It did not rush to its destination. It let the wind carry it, adjusting only when needed. Watching it, he began to understand that the summit was not the only reason to climb. There was value in the path itself, in the quiet moments, the unexpected views, the places where the air smelled of pine and the ground was soft with fallen needles. Hours passed. He crossed narrow ridges where the stones were slick with lichen, and broad meadows where wildflowers nodded gently in the breeze. He found an old cairn, its stones carefully stacked by hands long gone, marking a place where others had once stood. At times the climb was steep, and his legs burned, and at other times it levelled out, giving him the gift of easier steps. When he finally reached a high plateau just below the summit, the sun was beginning to sink. The sky was painted in deep oranges and soft purples, and the air was so still it felt as though the world was holding its breath. He sat there, looking out over the vast sweep of land, and felt no rush to go further. The mountain had guided him here, and that was enough for now. He thought again of the shepherd's words, "Do not conquer the mountain, let it guide you." Perhaps the true climb was never about reaching the top, but about learning to move with the mountain's rhythm, to accept its detours, to rest when it offered rest, and to notice the quiet beauty along the way. As the first stars began to appear, he knew he would continue in the morning. But tonight, he would sleep here on the plateau, with the mountain beneath him, the sky above, and the understanding that this path was not one to be conquered, but one to be walked in respect, step by step. The attic smelled faintly of cedar and old paper, the scent of years folded away in boxes and forgotten drawers. Dust floated in the still air, swirling lazily whenever a step disturbed the wooden floorboards. Sunlight slipped through a narrow window, catching on the motes and turning them into slow-moving stars. She had not been up here in years. The ladder had always creaked under her weight, and the low, sloping ceiling made her duck as she moved. But something in her heart had urged her to climb today. Perhaps it was the quiet of the morning, or the way a sudden breeze had rattled the shutters downstairs, whispering of memories tucked away above her head. In the far corner, beneath an old quilt draped over a trunk, she found the object she hadn't thought about in decades. A small leather-bound journal, the edges of its pages curled with age. She lifted it carefully, brushing away the dust, and sat cross-legged on the floor where a rectangle of sunlight warmed the boards. The journal's cover was worn smooth, the leather soft from years of being opened and closed. When she untied the faded ribbon and flipped to the first page, her own handwriting looked back at her, slanted, uneven letters from a much younger hand. She began to read. The entries were simple at first, little notes about the weather, the name of a friend she had met at school, dreams she had scribbled down in a hurry before they faded. But as she turned the pages, she saw stories unfolding, moments she had long forgotten. A summer spent helping her grandfather plant tomatoes in the garden. The day she had rescued a stray cat and kept it hidden in her room for a week before her parents found out. The winter her family had been snowed in for 3 days, and they had cooked meals over the fireplace, laughing in the dim light of candles. With each memory, she felt herself drawn deeper into a time when life had been smaller, but somehow fuller. She could almost hear the sound of her mother's voice calling her in for dinner, smell the wood smoke on her father's coat when he came in from the cold. Halfway through the journal, she found a folded piece of paper pressed between the pages. When she opened it, she saw a letter she had written to herself at 17, full of hope, questions, and a few quiet fears. She smiled at the earnestness in the words, at the way her younger self had believed that the world was wide and everything was still ahead of her. She wanted to reach back through time and reassure that girl, to tell her that while not everything would go as planned, she would gather treasures along the way that she couldn't yet imagine. She thought then of a saying her grandmother had once told her, "Memories are the treasures we keep forever." At the time, she hadn't understood the weight of it. But sitting here now, with the journal in her lap, she felt how true it was. These pages were not just words. They were pieces of herself, preserved in ink, carrying the warmth of moments long gone. She stayed in the attic for hours, reading until the sunlight shifted and the dust motes turned silver in the cooler light. Sometimes she laughed softly at a small detail she had forgotten. Other times she felt a sting in her eyes at a name or a place she would never see again. Yet even the bittersweet moments felt like treasures. They were proof that she had lived fully, loved deeply, and carried those pieces forward with her, even without realizing it. When she finally closed the journal, she held it against her chest for a long moment before slipping it into her bag. It did not belong back in the trunk, hidden away. It belonged closer to her now, somewhere she could reach for it when she needed to remember who she had been and the paths she had walked. As she climbed down from the attic, she felt lighter, though she carried more than when she went up. The house was quiet below, the afternoon sunlight spilling across the floor. She set the journal on the kitchen table and poured herself a cup of tea, thinking that perhaps later she would start a new one. After all, today would one day be a memory too, and perhaps years from now, she would sit in another sunlit corner and find herself here again, holding another treasure that time could not take away. The first fire of winter was always a quiet ritual in the little stone cottage. Outside, the air had turned sharp, carrying the faint bite of frost that clung stubbornly to the last fallen leaves. The days were growing shorter, the sky turning dusky well before the evening meal. But inside, the hearth was ready, swept clean, the grate set, and a small stack of split logs waiting like guests at the door. He moved slowly, as he always did now, lowering himself onto the stool beside the hearth. His hands were marked with the years, knuckles swollen, skin lined and spotted, but they still knew the familiar dance of fire making. First the kindling, thin sticks and curls of bark arranged with care. Then the log, chosen for its dryness and weight. He struck the match and touched it to the nest of twigs, watching as the flame caught and began to climb. The room filled with the faint crackle of wood waking to life. The fire spread slowly at first, licking along the bark, then flaring brighter as the log accepted the warmth. Soon the air was filled with the smell of burning oak, deep, earthy, comforting. Shadows flickered on the walls, moving in time with the flames. He leaned back and let the heat touch his face. This was the part he loved most, that moment when the cold still pressed against the windows, but the warmth began to bloom in the room, chasing the chill from the air. He reached for the old armchair by the fire, lowering himself into its worn embrace, and pulled a blanket over his knees. On the mantel above the hearth stood a small collection of framed photographs. His wife in the garden, smiling among rows of roses. His children as they once were, in mismatched scarves and boots, holding mugs of cocoa. The faces in those pictures were from other winters, yet the warmth of those days seemed to gather here with him, as if drawn by the firelight. A phrase drifted into his mind, one his mother had often spoken on evenings like this. A heart at peace gives life to the body. He had heard it as a boy while sitting cross-legged on the rug, watching her darn socks or shell peas while the fire roared. Back then, it sounded like something out of a book, nice enough to hear, but without much meaning. Now, he understood. Peace wasn't the absence of hardship. He had seen his share of cold winters, of losses that still ached like old wounds. But in this quiet, with the fire's glow wrapping itself around him, peace felt like a living thing. It breathed warmth into his chest, steadied the beat of his heart, and eased the weight in his shoulders. He thought of the years when life had been so busy that he'd hardly noticed the changing seasons. Winters had come and gone in a blur of work, travel, and long lists of things that could never quite be finished. Now the days moved more slowly, and in that slowness he found space. Space to listen to the fire crackle, to watch the logs collapse into embers, to feel the steady rhythm of his own breath. The tea kettle began to whistle in the kitchen. He rose carefully, the blanket falling away, and poured himself a mug. The steam rose in soft curls, carrying the scent of chamomile and honey. He returned to the armchair and set the mug on the small table beside him, letting his hands hover over it for warmth. Outside, the wind stirred, rattling the bare branches against the window pane. He listened without worry. The fire was strong now, its heat filling the room, its light dancing on the walls like an old friend telling a familiar story. He sipped his tea slowly, feeling it flow through him, warming him from the inside out. For a while, he thought of nothing at all. Not the tasks that might await him tomorrow, not the years behind him, or the ones ahead. Just the moment, just the warmth, just the peace that seemed to sit in the room with him, as real and solid as the chair beneath him. The logs burned down into a deep bed of glowing embers, the kind that would keep their heat long into the night. He knew he would sleep well, wrapped in the quiet that came not from the absence of sound, but from the presence of contentment. A heart at peace, he thought again, taking one last look at the fire before leaning back. It was true. In this moment, he could feel the truth of it in every steady beat. The fire would fade, the night would pass, but the peace would remain, quietly alive within him. The morning light poured in through the open shutters, carrying with it the crisp, clean scent of the fields beyond the cottage. A soft breeze slipped through the window, brushing against the linen curtains and sending them swaying lazily in the air. Somewhere in the distance, a lark was singing, its song rising and falling above the gentle hum of the waking countryside. He stood at the window, his hands resting lightly on the sill, and breathed deeply. The air was cool but not cold, the kind that seemed to clear away the remnants of dreams and set the mind at ease. Beyond the garden, the grass swayed gently, each blade tipped with dew that caught the sunlight like glass. The world felt new, as though it had been washed clean in the night and laid out fresh for anyone who cared to notice. On the table behind him, a stack of papers and an inkwell waited, the day's work. But he did not sit just yet. Instead, he lingered at the window, letting the breeze wrap around him. He remembered something his grandfather had once told him on a day much like this. Fresh air and fresh thoughts go hand in hand. At the time, he had smiled politely and returned to his reading, too young to see the truth in it. But now, years later, he knew exactly what his grandfather had meant. The air outside was more than just a comfort. It was a clearing of space. With each breath, it felt as though the noise of yesterday, the heaviness of worries, and the stale weight of tired thinking were being pushed out to make room for something lighter. It was as if the breeze itself carried possibilities, whispering them in soft, wordless tones to anyone willing to pause long enough to listen. He stepped away from the window and pulled on his boots. The morning was too fine to spend indoors just yet. The path from his cottage led down through a small orchard, where the trees stood in neat rows, their branches heavy with early apples. The air there was richer, tinged with the faint sweetness of fruit and the damp scent of soil, still dark from last night's rain. As he walked, the breeze followed him, playing at his collar and brushing gently against his cheek. He could feel the way it carried not just the scents of the orchard, but the distant traces of things unseen, the cool breath of the river in the valley, the sharp tang of pine from the wooded hills, the faint smoke from a chimney in the neighbouring farmstead. It was a tapestry of the world woven into something you could feel and taste with every inhale. He reached a low wooden gate that opened into a meadow. Beyond it, the grass was long and full of wildflowers, buttercups, daisies, and the soft purple of clover blooms. The wind moved through them in waves, bending them gently before letting them rise again. He stood there for a long time, watching the way the meadow swayed, thinking how much it resembled the way thoughts came and went in the mind when you gave them space to move. When he finally sat down in the grass, the ground was cool beneath him. He tilted his head back and closed his eyes, feeling the wind stir his hair. Without effort, his mind began to wander, not toward the lists and duties waiting back at the table, but toward ideas that felt unforced, like birds landing softly on a fence post. A line of poetry came to him unbidden, then the memory of an old friend's voice, then a plan for something small but worth doing. It struck him then that his grandfather's words had not been a quaint metaphor at all. The freshness of the air and the freshness of the mind were tied together in a way he had never quite appreciated. It wasn't simply that the air cleared the lungs, it cleared the inward spaces too, making room for thoughts that might otherwise never have found their way in. By the time he returned to the cottage, the sun was higher, and the breeze had grown warmer. He sat at the table, the papers before him no longer heavy with the pressure to be filled. The words came more easily now, flowing like the wind through an open field. He realised he had not just taken a walk, he had opened a window in his mind, and the air that had rushed in had swept the corners clean. As he dipped his pen into the inkwell, he glanced once more at the open shutters, the curtain still moving gently in the breeze. The air outside would keep shifting, carrying new scents, new sounds, new currents from beyond the hills. And so would his thoughts, so long as he remembered to give them space to breathe. The old bell tower stood at the far end of the village, its stone walls weathered smooth by centuries of wind and rain. At its base, a narrow cobblestone path led to a small wooden door, painted red long ago but now faded and peeling. Above, the tower rose into the sky, its narrow windows letting in the cool light of morning. From within came the faint, steady creak of the great rope as it swayed in the draught. It was the first morning of autumn when he decided to climb the tower again. He had made the ascent many times before, but never without a sense of reverence. The spiral staircase was steep and narrow, each stone step worn in the middle from generations of feet. As he climbed, the air grew cooler, the light dimmer, until finally he emerged into the chamber where the great bell hung. The bell was enormous, taller than a man, with a dark bronze surface that seemed to hold the memory of every note it had ever rung. Its lip was smooth from years of movement, and the clapper hung in the centre like a pendulum, waiting for the right moment to swing. From here, he could see out across the rooftops of the village, the smoke curling lazily from chimneys, the fields beyond already touched with the faint gold of the season's change. The bell had always been more than a tool for telling time. It had marked births and deaths, called people to gatherings, warned of storms and fires. But there were days, like today, when it rang not to announce anything urgent, but to remind the village to pause. The elders called it the rest bell, a tradition so old that no one remembered who had begun it. At midday on certain days, the bell would toll slowly, its deep voice carrying across the fields, telling everyone to stop their work, take a breath, and remember that life was more than the tasks at hand. He wrapped his hands around the thick, frayed rope. It was rough beneath his palms, the fibres softened only slightly by years of use. He waited, listening to the stillness in the chamber, the faint whisper of wind against the tower walls. Then with a steady pull, he set the bell in motion. The first note rolled out like a wave, slow and heavy, spreading far into the air. It was not a sound you merely heard, you felt it in your chest, in your bones. The rope rose and fell in his hand as the bell swung, sending out another deep, resonant tone. Somewhere below, shutters were pushed open, and faces turned toward the tower. He imagined the sound reaching the baker, who would pause with his hands deep in the dough, the seamstress, who would set down her needle, the shepherd in the hills, who would lean on his staff and listen. The bell didn't demand stillness, it invited it. It reminded the village that rest was not a weakness or a waste, but a renewal, the same way the land itself needed seasons to lie fallow before it could bloom again. After the final toll, the bell settled slowly, its great body swaying gently before coming to rest. The echoes faded into the open air, leaving behind a kind of hush that felt deeper than silence. He stood there for a while, watching the rooftops and the distant line of trees. From this height, the worries and noise of the village seemed small, softened by distance. He thought of a saying his grandmother used to repeat whenever he worked too long without stopping. Rest is not idleness, but a renewal of the soul. He had always taken it as her way of convincing him to slow down, but now he understood it as something truer. Rest wasn't an absence of work. It was work of another kind, the work of mending what couldn't be seen. He took one last look at the bell, its bronze catching a faint gleam of sunlight through the narrow window. Then he made his way down the spiral stairs, the echo of his footsteps mingling with the fading memory of the bell's voice. Outside, the village moved more slowly. People leaned against doorways, talking softly. A child sat in the grass beside the path, tracing patterns in the dirt. Even the wind seemed to move at a gentler pace. He walked back through the square, feeling the stillness that the bell had called into being. It would not last forever. Soon the tasks would resume. The hammers and saws and market cries would return. But for now, there was a shared pause, a breath held in the heart of the day, and in that pause lay a kind of quiet strength. And he knew, as he headed home, that the next time the rest bell rang, the village would answer in the same way, with a willingness to stop, to listen, and to remember that life is made richer, not only by what we do, but also by the moments when we simply allow ourselves to be. The village well stood in the centre of the square, its stones worn smooth by centuries of hands and feet. Moss grew in the cracks between the lower rocks, and the wooden roof above it had faded to a silvery grey under years of sun and rain. A heavy rope hung from the pulley, its fibres frayed but strong, and at the end of it rested an old wooden bucket bound with iron bands. It was early morning, and the square was still quiet. A thin mist clung to the air, softening the edges of the market stalls and the narrow streets leading away from the square. The only sounds were the faint rustle of leaves from the sycamore tree beside the well and the distant clucking of hens in someone's yards. A young man approached, carrying an empty jug. He had walked here from the edge of the village as he did most mornings, but today something felt different. Perhaps it was the stillness of the square, or the way the mist seemed to hold the world in place for a moment. He placed his jug beside the well and took hold of the rope, lowering the bucket into the cool darkness below. The sound of the bucket hitting the water was faint, but satisfying. A gentle splash that echoed up the shaft. He began to pull it back up, feeling the weight grow as the rope coiled in his hands. When the bucket emerged, droplets streamed from its sides, catching the early sunlight in tiny glimmers. He poured the water into his jug slowly, watching it swirl and settle before replacing the bucket for the next person who might come. As he secured the lid on his jug, he noticed movement in the mist. An older woman from the other side of the square making her way toward him. She was carrying two small pails, one in each hand, her back bent slightly from age, but her steps steady. Without thinking, he picked up the bucket again and lowered it for her. She smiled as she reached the well, setting her pails down and taking a moment to catch her breath. "You're up early," she said. He nodded, smiling back. "The morning feels different today, still." "It's the mist," she replied. "It makes the world quieter, easier to hear the important things." He wasn't sure exactly what she meant, but he liked the sound of it. When the bucket came up full again, he poured half into one of her pails, then half into the other. She thanked him, her eyes crinkling at the corners, and picked them up again. As she walked away, he thought about something his father used to say: "We rise by lifting others." It had always sounded like a noble phrase, but perhaps too big for ordinary life. Yet here, with the cool handle of the bucket still damp in his hand, he realised it could be as simple as this: sharing the weight, lightening someone's burden even for a moment. Before he could leave, a small boy came running into the square, clutching a cup in both hands. He looked out of breath, his hair tousled from sleep. The boy's mother was ill, and he had been sent to fetch water for her tea. Without hesitation, the young man took the cup, filled it from the bucket, and handed it back carefully, so the boy wouldn't spill a drop. The boy grinned his thanks and darted away, the cup trembling slightly in his grip, but still full. The young man watched him go, then stood for a moment in the quiet square, the mist beginning to lift around him. He realised the well was more than just a place to draw water. It was where the village came together, where people saw each other's faces in the early hours, where burdens were eased without the need for grand gestures or long speeches. The well was a giver, but it was also a gathering place, a reminder that the act of helping was not only about what was given, but about the connection formed in the giving. By the time he picked up his jug and started home, the square had begun to stir. The baker was sweeping his doorstep. A cart rattled over the cobblestones, bringing fresh vegetables from the fields. A woman passed by with a basket of laundry balanced on her hip, and he stepped aside to let her draw water as he had for the others. The young man walked back through the streets with the sense that the day had already been made better, not just for those he had helped, but for himself as well. The image of the well stayed in his mind, solid, dependable, giving freely to whoever came to it. And as he crossed the small wooden bridge leading toward his own home, he thought that perhaps the same was true for people. If you made yourself a place where others could find help, refreshment, or a moment of relief, you didn't lose anything. Instead, like the well, you were constantly refilled, over and over again. The road curved gently through rolling fields, its packed earth lined with hedgerows that hummed with the quiet life of insects and small birds. A soft haze lay over the distant hills, blurring the line where the land met the sky. The sun was low, its light golden and warm, stretching the shadows of the trees far across the ground. A man walked alone along this road, his boots scuffing lightly against the dust. His pack was slung over one shoulder, and his steps were unhurried. He had been travelling for days, guided by a vague sense of direction and a map that was more memory than ink. The village he sought lay somewhere beyond the hills, but no one had been able to tell him exactly how far. Earlier that week, in a roadside inn, an old woman had warned him, sometimes the longest way around is the shortest way home. At the time, he'd smiled politely and thought little of it, but as he followed the winding road, her words returned to him, circling in his mind like the lazy flight of the crows overhead. The straight road had been tempting. He'd seen its beginning, a hard-packed stretch that cut across the fields toward the hills in a single, uncompromising line. But the innkeeper had advised against it. The straight road, he'd said, passed through a stretch of marshland that could be treacherous after the rains. "You'll save no time if you find yourself knee-deep in mud," the man had warned. Better to take the high road around. So he had turned onto this longer path, one that wound like a river through the countryside. At first, the slowness had frustrated him. Every bend in the road seemed to reveal another bend beyond it, and the hills never appeared to grow closer. But with the passing hours, something began to shift. The hedgerows gave way to orchards heavy with apples, their branches dipping low. A farmer waved to him from a ladder, tossing down a piece of fruit with a grin. The man caught it and bit into its crisp sweetness, the juice running down his chin. He thought of how easily he would have missed this moment had he taken the straight road. Further on, he came to a stone bridge arching over a clear, shallow stream. The water whispered over smooth rocks, and the banks were lined with wildflowers still clinging to the last colours of summer. He stopped there for a while, kneeling to drink and letting the cold water wash the dust from his hands. The air smelled faintly of mint growing wild among the stones. The road climbed higher, after the bridge, leading him to a ridge from which the land opened in every direction. Fields, woods, and winding rivers stretched to the horizon. From here, the hills he sought no longer looked distant. They rose before him, softened by the light of the late afternoon. The view filled him with a quiet contentment, a sense that he was exactly where he was meant to be. As the sun dipped lower, he reached a small village tucked into a fold of the hills. Children played in the square, chasing one another around the fountain. A baker stood in his doorway, the smell of warm bread drifting into the streets. The man paused to speak with him and learned that the road ahead, though still long, was clear and safe. That evening, he found a place to sleep in a small inn overlooking the valley. From the window of his room, he could see the road he had travelled curling away into the distance, each turn now part of the story that had brought him here. He realised then that the old woman's words had been less about roads and more about the way one moves through life. The fastest way is not always the best, and what we call detours are often the very paths that shape us. As the light faded from the sky and the first stars appeared, he thought about the next day's journey. The road ahead would still twist and turn, but he no longer wished for it to be straight. The extra miles had given him more than distance. They had given him the gift of moments, of faces, of places that would stay with him long after the journey was done. And so he lay down to sleep with the windows open to the cool night air, hearing the faint hum of the village below, content to keep walking the long way home. The loom sat in the corner of the quiet room, its wooden frame polished smooth by years of work. Morning light filtered through the window, falling in pale gold across the threads stretched taut between the beams. They shimmered faintly when the light caught them, a delicate forest of lines waiting to be brought together. The air smelled faintly of wool and dye, and the floor beneath the loom was sprinkled with stray threads that had drifted down over the years, remnants of cloth already made and gone. The weaver sat before the loom, her back straight but relaxed, her hands resting lightly on the shuttle. She had been weaving since before sunrise, the steady rhythm of her work keeping time with the quiet in the house. Her fingers moved with practiced ease, passing the shuttle back and forth, tightening the threads, beating them into place with a soft, measured thump. This piece was special. It was a commission from the family who lived on the far side of the valley to mark the marriage of their eldest daughter. The colours had been chosen with care, a deep, rich green like the fields after rain, a warm gold to echo the sunlight at harvest, and a cool blue that reminded her of the river that ran between their lands. She had dyed each skein herself, stirring the wool in great steaming pots, watching the colours seep into the fibres. As she worked, she thought about the proverb her own mother had once told her. Life is a tapestry woven with both light and dark threads. At the time, she had only understood the words in the most literal way. That cloth, to be beautiful and strong, needed contrast. But over the years, she had come to see the deeper truth. She had woven for families celebrating births, their cloth bright with warm colours. She had woven for mourning, using deep greys and blacks that spoke of loss. And often, the two kinds of threads, the joyful and the sombre, had been woven side by side in the same piece, because life rarely kept them apart. Her own life had been like that, There had been seasons when laughter filled the air and the work seemed light in her hands, and others when the shuttle had felt heavy, her thoughts clouded by worry or grief. But in the end, the cloth always held together. The dark threads gave the light ones shape, made them shine more clearly. Without one, the other lost its meaning. She paused to sip from a cup of tea, growing cool beside her. Outside the window, the wind moved gently through the trees, sending dappled shadows over the wall. The shifting light made the threads on the loom change subtly, as though the cloth itself were breathing. Her cat, an old grey creature with ears torn from long ago fights, padded into the room and curled up near her feet. She smiled and reached down to scratch its head before picking up the shuttle again. The rhythm resumed, back and forth, beat and pull, and with each pass the pattern grew clearer. By midday, she could see the heart of the design forming. The gold threads seemed to catch the sun from the window, while the blue lines wound through the green like a river cutting through the fields. It reminded her of walking home in the evenings after visiting the valley market, the last light of day spilling across the water, the fields darkening into shadow. She thought then about how every life was like a weaving in progress. You could not always choose the threads that came into your hands. Some arrived bright and fine, others coarse or knotted. But you could choose how to work them in, how to find a place for each so that the cloth held together. Even the flaws could be worked into the design, becoming part of the story rather than spoiling it. As the afternoon deepened, she worked steadily until the piece was nearly finished. She ran her fingers over the fabric, feeling the slight differences in texture where one dye had taken more deeply than another. It was imperfect, but in a way that made it alive. When she tied off the last threads and cut the tapestry free from the loom, she held it up to the light. The gold glowed, the green soothed, and the blue curved like a quiet stream. Together, the colours told a story, not just of a marriage, but of all the moments that would come after. The celebrations and the trials, the seasons of brightness and the seasons of shadow, all bound together in something strong enough to last. She folded the tapestry carefully and set it aside, knowing that when the family received it, they would see more than just cloth. They would see the work of hands that understood that beauty and strength came from the blend of many threads, from weaving both the light and the dark into something whole. The bookshop sat at the corner of a narrow cobblestone street. Its front window, framed by weathered shutters, painted a faded shade of blue. On rainy days, the glass fogged slightly from the warmth inside, and the faint glow of lamplight made the place look like a haven for anyone seeking shelter from the damp. The sign above the door had once been crisp and bold, but the years had softened it, the letters curling faintly at the edges. Inside, the air smelled of paper, dust, and a trace of something sweet, perhaps the cinnamon tea the shopkeeper brewed each morning. Wooden shelves climbed to the ceiling, their edges smoothed by the touch of countless hands. The books were not arranged with the rigid order of a library. Instead, they seemed to have found their own places, clustering in comfortable groups as if keeping old friends close. In the back corner, beneath a low hanging lamp, the shopkeeper sat behind a desk worn smooth, where his elbows rested each day. He was an older man, with a gentle stoop to his shoulders and eyes that crinkled when he smiled. His hair was silver now, but he had been keeping this shop since his youth, and he knew every title on the shelves by heart. That morning, a young woman entered, Shaking the rain from her coat, she glanced around with the wide-eyed wonder of someone stepping into a different world. The shopkeeper rose and offered her a warm greeting, asking if she was looking for something in particular. She hesitated, then said she was searching for a book her grandmother used to read to her. The memory of it had been tugging at her for weeks, though she could not remember the title. He nodded slowly, asking her to describe it. She spoke of a story about a wandering bird who travelled through many lands, meeting people and learning their wisdom before returning home. As she spoke, his eyes lit with recognition. Without a word, he crossed the shop and climbed a short ladder to reach a high shelf. Moments later, he returned with a thin, cloth-bound book, its spine soft with age. Her face brightened as she took it in her hands, running her fingers over the faded cover. It was as if she were holding a piece of her childhood. She opened it carefully, the pages whispering as they turned, and breathed in the faint scent of old paper and ink. The shopkeeper smiled at the way she lingered over each page. "Knowledge is a garden," he said quietly. "If it is not cultivated, it cannot be harvested." She looked up, curious. "My father told me that when I was your age," he explained. "I didn't understand it at first, but I've spent my life tending this garden. Every book is a seed, and every reader is the rain or the sun that helps it grow. Some seeds take root right away. Others lie dormant until the right moment, and then they bloom." He gestured toward the shelves, where volumes of all sizes and colours leaned together. "These books hold stories, ideas, lessons, and dreams. Left closed, they are nothing but ink and paper. But in the hands of someone who reads, they can change the shape of a life." The young woman nodded, her fingers lightening slightly on the book. She realised that her grandmother, in reading to her, had planted seeds she had not even known were there. The lessons of those stories had shaped her quietly, like roots growing beneath the soil. They spoke for a while longer, the rain pattering softly against the windows. She asked about other books he would recommend, and he led her to a shelf where the bindings glowed faintly in the lamplight. Each time he pulled a book down, he shared a little about where it had come from. A market stall in another country, a library that had been closing, a customer who had traded it for something else. Every book had a journey, and every journey was part of the garden he tended. When she finally left, the book wrapped carefully in brown paper, the rain had slowed to a fine mist. She stepped out into the street feeling lighter, the warmth of the shop still clinging to her. She knew she would return, not only to find other books, but to wander again among the rows of stories, to water the seeds her grandmother had planted so long ago. Inside, the shopkeeper returned to his desk. He poured himself a cup of tea, the steam curling upwards, and listened to the quiet hum of the shop. The books around him seemed almost to breathe, waiting for the next person to open them and let their words take root. In that stillness, he smiled to himself, knowing that his garden, though made of paper and ink, was one that would never stop growing. The harbour was waking slowly, wrapped in the pale blush of dawn. The air carried the mingled scents of salt, damp woods, and the faint metallic tang of fish. Wooden docks stretched into the still water, their pilings darkened from years of tides rising and falling. Small boats rocked gently at their moorings, their ropes creaking softly with each shift. A fisherman stood near the edge of the pier, his hands moving with practiced ease as he checked the knots on his nets. His weathered coat smelled faintly of the sea, and his boots bore the marks of many mornings like this. He had been coming here for most of his life, rising before the sun, preparing to cast his lines into waters that never promised the same yield twice. Today the sea was calm, a smooth, glassy expanse that reflected the pastel streaks of the sky. The fisherman paused in his work to gaze out at it, remembering something his father used to say, "Cast your bread upon the waters, for after many days you will find it again." As a boy, he had thought it was simply about patience in fishing, but the older he grew, the more he understood that it was about trust, about giving without the guarantee of return, and about faith in the unseen work that happens beneath the surface. He loaded the nets into his small wooden boat, their coarse fibres heavy against his hands. With a steady push, he drifted away from the dock, the water parting silently around the hull. Seabirds wheeled overhead, their cries sharp against the quiet morning. Out on the open water, he stopped the boat and let it rest. The world felt larger here, the horizon unbroken except for the faint line of distant land. He began casting his nets, the weights splashing into the depths with a sound that seemed to disappear almost instantly. The nets sank out of sight, slipping into the silent world below, where currents and shadows moved unseen. There was no telling what he might bring up. Perhaps a full net, perhaps nothing at all. The sea gave what it wished, and no man could force its hand. That was the way of it, and the fisherman had long since learned to accept it. Yet even in the uncertainty, there was a kind of peace. He knew that his work today, whether it brought abundance or scarcity, was part of something larger, that the effort itself mattered, that each cast built upon the last. While he waited, he repaired a tear in one of the older nets. The sun rose higher, turning the water from silver to blue. A gentle swell lifted the boat and set it down again, a rhythm that matched the slow, steady beat of his thoughts. He thought of the many ways people cast their bread upon the waters, through kindness, through work, through the sharing of what they had, often without seeing the ripple of what came after. When he finally began to pull in the nets, the weight in them made his shoulders ache. The ropes scraped against his palms, damp and rough. Slowly the first glimmers appeared, the flash of scales, the movement of life caught from the unseen depths. By the time the nets were in, he had enough to fill his baskets, enough to take to the market and share with his neighbours, enough to set aside for tomorrow. He sat for a moment before turning the boat toward shore, watching the sun scatter gold across the surface of the water. It occurred to him that there were days when he had cast and found nothing, and yet even then he had not stopped coming back. Each morning was its own beginning, each cast its own act of trust. As he rowed back to the harbour, the village was stirring, smoke curling from chimneys, voices calling across the docks, the smell of fresh bread drifting from the bakery near the waterfront. When he stepped ashore, a child ran to meet him, eager to see what the nets had brought. He knelt and handed the boy a small fish, its scales gleaming in the morning light, and the child's face lit up as though he had been given a treasure. The fisherman smiled to himself. His father had been right. What you cast out into the world often returns to you, though not always in the form you expect. Sometimes it came back in the weight of a full net. other times in the joy on a child's face. Either way, it was worth the casting. And so, as he carried his baskets toward the market, the harbour now alive with movement and voices, he knew he would rise again tomorrow before the sun, push his boat into the stillness of the water, and trust the sea to answer in its own time. The mountains rose in the distance, their peaks softened by a haze of early morning light. The road leading toward them wound through fields and clusters of trees, each bend revealing a slightly different view of their vast, unmoving presence. To the traveller walking along that road, they seemed both near enough to touch and impossibly far away, their slopes layered in shades of blue and grey. He had been walking for hours when the first incline began. It was subtle at first, hardly more than a gentle rise beneath his boots, but soon the ground tilted more steeply, and the road became a narrow trail edged with rocks and hardy grasses. His breath grew heavier, and the rhythm of his steps slowed. The weight of his pack pressed harder against his shoulders, yet something within him urged him forward. He remembered a line his mentor had once spoken: "Go to the ant, consider its ways, and be wise." At the time, he had thought it a strange piece of advice. What could a person learn from something so small? But now, with the trail climbing endlessly ahead of him, he began to see the meaning. The ant moved steadily, carrying what it could, never hurrying but never stopping, always focused on the task before it. The path wound through a stand of pines, their scent sharp and clean in the cool air. Sunlight filtered through the branches in narrow shafts, casting shifting patterns on the ground. Somewhere above, a bird called, its voice carrying far in the stillness. The traveller paused to listen, leaning against the rough bark of a tree, and felt the slow, steady beat of his heart begin to match the quiet rhythm of the forest. When he set out again, his steps were smaller, more deliberate. The climb was no less steep, but by focusing only on the next few paces, instead of the entire distance to the summit, the weight on his shoulders seemed lighter. He thought again of the ant, how it never looked at the entire field it must cross, but only at the grain it was carrying and the step it was taking now. Hours passed. The trail narrowed further, curling around the side of the mountain where the ground fell away sharply to one side. Far below, he could see the river he had crossed that morning, its surface catching the sun like a silver ribbon. The view was breathtaking, but he did not linger long. The climb demanded his attention, and he knew that looking too far ahead or too far down could unsteady his steps. At last, he reached a ridge where the ground levelled out. A wide stretch of grass and wildflowers spread before him, the air cooler here, the wind carrying the faint scent of snow from the peaks beyond. He dropped his pack and sat, letting the silence settle around him. The effort of the climb had left his muscles aching, but beneath the fatigue was a deep satisfaction, the kind that came not from arriving quickly, but from having persevered through each small, deliberate step. From this height, he could see the path winding back through the valley, a pale thread among the green fields. The distance he had travelled seemed immense, though he had taken it one small portion at a time. He realised then that his mentor's words had not been about ants at all, but about the wisdom of patience, the quiet strength of persistence. When the wind shifted, he caught sight of another trail, leading upward toward the next peak. It would be a harder climb, steeper and colder, and he was not yet sure if he would take it. But for now, he was content to rest, to breathe in the clear mountain air, and to know that he had reached this place not by rushing, but by steady, unwavering movement, step by step, like the ant. He lay back in the grass, watching the clouds drift slowly across the sky. The mountains stood unmoved around him, their slopes bathed in sunlight, their peaks still dusted with snow. He thought of the road that had brought him here, and the many roads that still waited ahead, and he smiled, knowing that when the time came, he would rise, lift his pack once more, and keep walking, one sure step at a time. The garden lay behind a weathered wooden gate, its hinges rolling softly as it swung open. Inside, the air felt different, warmer somehow, alive with the mingled scents of earth, herbs and blossoms. Sunlight filtered through the branches of fruit trees, casting dappled patterns over winding stone paths. The hum of bees filled the stillness, a quiet music that seemed to soothe the very air. At the centre of the garden was an old man, kneeling in the soil with a trowel in his hand. His hat shaded his face, but the lines at the corners of his eyes deepened when he looked up and smiled. Beside him sat a basket half filled with tomatoes, their skins warm from the sun, and bunches of basil tied with twine. He rose slowly, brushing the dirt from his knees, and gestured toward the rows of plants. "It's like this," he said in a voice as gentle as the wind rustling the leaves. "You can't rush a garden. You give it water, you give it care, but in the end, you must let it grow in its own time." The visitor followed him down one of the paths, listening as the old man spoke of planting seasons, of soil turned in the spring, of compost and careful pruning. But between the talk of seeds and sunlight, there were other lessons woven in, lessons about patience, trust, and the slow, steady work that could never be hurried. They stopped beside a row of young bean plants climbing their stakes. "These," the gardener said, touching the slender stems, "will be heavy with pods by summer. But if I tried to force them, to make them grow faster, I'd only break them. Everything has its season." The visitor thought about that, about the way the world often pushed for quick results. Faster harvests, faster journeys, faster answers. Yet here was a place where the pace was set not by urgency, but by the rhythm of the earth itself. The old man led the way to a patch of sunflowers standing tall at the edge of the garden. Their broad faces followed the sun, turning slowly through the day. "They don't strain to reach the light," he said softly. "They just follow it. Every morning they begin again." They paused in the shade of an apple tree, heavy with blossoms. Petals drifted down like pale snow, settling on the ground and on the brim of the gardener's hat. He reached up to pluck one blossom and held it out. "The fruit will come," he said. "But first there's the flower. You can't skip it. It's part of the work, part of the beauty." As they walked, the visitor noticed the way the garden seemed to hold a quiet conversation with itself. The herbs perfumed the air for the bees. The flowers drew the bees to the vegetables. The vegetables returned nourishment to the gardener. It was a circle, each part tending to the others in its own way. By the time they reached the far corner, the sun was lower in the sky. The old man set down his basket and began to water the plants, his movements unhurried, as if each drop mattered. The visitor realised then that tending a garden was not just about food or flowers. It was about shaping a place where patience bore fruit, where care became something visible, tangible, and sustaining. They sat together on a low bench by the gate as the evening light turned the garden gold. The old man spoke once more. You can learn a lot from a garden if you're willing to wait. You plant, you water, you watch, and in time, what you've sown will return to you, sometimes in ways you didn't expect. The visitor looked out over the rows of green, the blossoms, the fruit just beginning to swell on the branches. In that moment, the truth of his words felt as steady and certain as the roots beneath the soil. And when they finally rose to leave, the scent of basil and warm earth seemed to follow, carrying with it the quiet promise that all good things take time to grow. The marketplace was already alive with sound by the time the first rays of sunlight spilled over the rooftops. Wooden stalls lined the narrow square, their awnings striped in bright colours that fluttered gently in the morning breeze. Merchants called out greetings to early shoppers, their voices mingling with the clatter of carts and the low murmur of bargaining. The air was thick with scents. Warm bread just pulled from ovens, baskets of oranges spilling their sharp sweetness into the air, the earthy spice of cinnamon drifting from a table stacked high with jars. A fishmonger arranged his morning catch on a bed of crushed ice, the silver scales catching the light. Beside him, a woman in a bright scarf laid out bolts of dyed fabric, their colours rich and deep, like the inside of a jewel. Near the centre of the square, a young man carried a small wooden crate, carefully setting it down beside a stall that sold hand-carved bowls and spoons. Inside the crate were loaves of bread, still warm from his mother's oven. He greeted the vendor warmly, exchanging a loaf for a carved spoon she had promised him the week before. Around him, the marketplace was more than a place to buy and sell. It was where news travelled faster than the wind. A shepherd from the hills told of a late lamb born under the full moon. A pair of travellers shared stories from distant villages, their words drawing a small crowd eager for a taste of the wider world. Children darted between the stalls, laughing, sometimes returning with a piece of fruit gifted by a kind merchant. As the young man moved through the crowd, he remembered something his grandfather used to say. A generous heart enriches all it touches. It was a phrase that seemed almost visible here, in the way people traded not only goods, but kindness. A bag of apples given freely to a widow, a farmer slipping extra eggs into a neighbour's basket, a spice seller pressing a small pouch of saffron into a young bride's hands with a wink. At one stall, he stopped to help an elderly man lift a heavy sack of grain onto a cart. The man thanked him, insisting he take a jar of honey in return. At another, he bought a small bundle of lavender from a woman who refused his payment, telling him to pass it along to someone who needed cheering. By midday, the square was full to bursting. Music drifted through the air, from a corner where a fiddler played, his bow dancing over the strings. People clapped along, some even dancing in the open space between stalls. The sound of laughter carried above the music, blending into the hum of the day. The young man sat for a moment on the edge of a fountain, watching it all. Coins glinted in the water below him, each one a small wish tossed in by someone passing through. He thought about how the marketplace worked, not because of the goods alone, but because of the trust and goodwill that tied the people together. Without it, the stalls would be empty, the air silent. In the afternoon, as the sun began to dip, the crowd thinned. Merchants packed away their unsold goods, pausing to share a final word or a laugh with their neighbours. The smell of roasting chestnuts drifted from a corner, drawing those still lingering in the square. The young man traded the last of his bread for a handful of the warm, fragrant nuts, tucking them into his pocket. As he walked home through the quieting streets, the sound of the market still echoed faintly in his mind. The voices, the music, the easy rhythm of giving and receiving. He realised that the true wealth of the marketplace wasn't measured in coins or goods, but in the way it drew people together, weaving their lives into a single, living tapestry of shared abundance. And he knew, as he turned the corner toward home, that when the market opened again next week, he would be there, not just to trade, but to be part of that exchange of warmth and goodwill that made the square feel like the heart of the village. The river moved with an unhurried grace, its surface broken only by the ripple of wind and the occasional leap of a fish. Along its banks, reeds swayed gently, their thin blades whispering to one another in the current's breath. The water reflected the sky above, a deep, unbroken blue that seemed to stretch forever, yet beneath the surface it held a world unseen, where shadows shifted and glimmers of silver darted through the depths. A young woman stood at the edge of the water, her feet sinking slightly into the soft earth. In her hands, she held a small wooden bucket, worn smooth from years of use. She had come to draw water for her household, but instead of moving quickly, she lingered, listening to the steady murmur of the river. Its voice was constant, yet always changing, a language she could not quite understand, but felt she could almost translate if she stayed long enough. When she knelt to fill the bucket, the reflection of her own face wavered on the surface. For a moment she studied it, not in vanity, but with a quiet curiosity, as though she were looking at someone she had only just begun to know. The water shimmered around her fingers, cool and alive, and she thought of a proverb her father often repeated: "As water reflects the face, so the heart reflects the person." She remembered the first time he had said it to her. She had been a child then, impatient and easily angered, frustrated when others did not think or act as she did. Her father had brought her to this very river and asked her to look into the water. "Tell me what you see," he had said. She had answered simply, "My face." He had smiled, then told her to throw a pebble into the river. The ripples distorted her reflection, breaking it into fragments. "The water shows you what is there," he had explained, "but it can only reflect clearly when it is still. The heart is the same." Now, years later, she understood more. The way she spoke to others, the patience she gave or withheld, the kindness she offered or denied, all of it was a reflection of what lived inside her. And just as the river could be stirred into chaos by a passing wind, so too could the heart be troubled by anger, fear, or pride. She set the bucket down and sat on the grassy bank. Across the river, she saw an elderly man leading a donkey along a narrow path. They moved slowly, in no rush, the animal's ears twitching in time with the sound of the water. A little farther downstream, two boys were skipping stones, their laughter ringing out as each one tried to send a pebble dancing further than the last. The ripples from their throws merged and faded, disappearing into the steady current. The river did not hold on to them. It accepted the disturbance, then returned to stillness. She thought about that, how easy it was to cling to the moments that troubled her, replaying words that had hurt, mistakes that had embarrassed her, wrongs she wished she had set right. The river's lesson was simple. Take what comes, let it pass, and flow on. When she finally rose to fill her bucket, the water was clear again. She dipped it slowly, watching it fill until the surface inside was smooth enough to show her reflection once more. This time, she smiled at it, not because everything in her life was perfect, but because she knew she could choose what she allowed to remain in her heart. As she carried the bucket home, the path wound close enough to the water that she could still hear its soft murmur. It was the same sound it had made on the day her father first brought her here, the same sound it would make long after she was gone. The river reflected the sky and the trees and the faces that leaned over it, but it also reflected something less visible, the reminder that what is within will always shape what is seen. By the time she reached her door, the bucket was heavy in her hands, but her heart felt lighter, and she thought that perhaps the next time she looked into the water, she would not only see her face, she would see the reflection of the person she was becoming. The road into the hills was quiet, except for the crunch of dry leaves beneath the traveller's boots. Autumn had painted the landscape in deep reds, golds and fading greens, the colours blending like strokes on an old, careful canvas. Here and there, the wind stirred, loosening a cluster of leaves that spiralled slowly to the ground. The air held that faint, sharp scent that always came before rain, though the sky was still a muted blue. The traveller was a merchant, his pack filled with goods he hoped to trade in the villages beyond the hills. He moved at a steady pace, his thoughts as measured as his steps. At a bend in the road, he caught sight of something unusual. A man kneeling near the side of the path, examining the ground as though reading a book no one else could see. The merchant slowed his steps, curious. The kneeling man looked up, his eyes bright and calm. He was older, his clothes plain but well kept, and there was an unhurried way about him, as though he had all the time in the world. "Is something lost?" the merchant asked. "Not lost," the man replied. "Only observed." He rose and brushed the dust from his hands. "The ants," he explained, pointing to a narrow trail of them carrying bits of leaf and grain across the path. "Watch them long enough, and you will see the wisdom of their work." The merchant tilted his head, following the tiny line of movement. Each ant carried a burden many times its own size, yet none seemed to stumble or fall behind. They moved in perfect coordination, never colliding, never straying from their path. "They work together," the older man continued. "No one tells them who should carry what, yet the task is shared. Each does what it can, and in doing so, they achieve what would be impossible alone." The merchant watched for a while, then smiled faintly. "I suppose that's true for people as well." The older man's gaze lingered on the ants. "More than you think. They store in times of plenty, so they will not starve in times of want. They do not waste what they gather, and they do not rest because their work is done. They rest so they can continue the work tomorrow." The merchant thought about his own life. He often measured his success by the size of his profits, rushing from one deal to the next without pause. But here, on this quiet road, the ants seemed to be offering a different kind of measure, one built on cooperation, preparation, and persistence rather than haste. When he looked up again, the older man was already walking away, his steps slow and steady along the road. The merchant adjusted the strap of his pack and followed at his own pace, the image of the ants still vivid in his mind. By midday, the road climbed higher, offering a view of the valley below. Fields spread out in neat squares, the autumn harvest half complete. Farmers moved among the rows, their work deliberate but unhurried. The merchant thought again of the ants, of how they carried together and stored for the future. And he realised the same principle was alive here in the fields. Each person contributing, each season preparing the way for the next. That evening, when he reached the small village where he would spend the night, he shared his goods at the marketplace. But instead of pressing for the highest price, he traded with more thought, ensuring that what he gave matched what the other could truly afford to offer. It felt different, not a loss, but a kind of gain that could not be weighed in coins. Later in the quiet of the inn, he unpacked his goods to prepare for the next day's trading. He set aside a small portion of his best wares, not for sale, but for giving to those in the next village who might need them most. He thought of the ants again, how each one carried only what it could, and yet together they fed the whole colony. Before he slept, he stepped outside into the cool night air. The road ahead was silver under the moonlight, the hills dark against the stars. Somewhere beneath the grass and earth, the ants were still at work in their hidden chambers, storing away what they had gathered. The merchant smiled, feeling the weight of his pack not as a burden, but as a share of the work he could offer. And when morning came, he would take to the road again, carrying not just goods, but a new way of measuring the worth of his journey, not by how much he gained, but by how well he worked alongside others to see that all could endure. The rain had been falling since before dawn, a soft and steady rhythm that wrapped the village in a veil of silver. Roof tiles glistened, cobblestones shone dark underfoot, and the air carried the clean scent of wet earth and leaves. Down by the narrow lane that led toward the old stone bridge, a woman stood beneath the eaves of her small shop, watching the drops gather and fall from the edge of the roof. Her shop was a humble one, a place where travellers and neighbours alike could find small necessities, candles, dried herbs, jars of honey, and the occasional handmade trinket. She kept it not for wealth, but because it allowed her to know the people who passed through, to hear their stories, and to offer what she could when it was needed. This morning had been quiet, the streets empty but for the occasional figure hurrying past with a hood drawn low. She thought she might close early, but just as she was about to pull the shutters, the door creaked open. A boy stepped inside, dripping from head to toe, his cheeks flushed from the chill. In his hands, he clutched a small, crumpled pouch of coins. He glanced at the shelves uncertainly, then approached the counter. "I need a candle," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. She brought one from the shelf, a simple beeswax taper, its scent faintly sweet. As she wrapped it in paper to keep it dry, she asked, "Is it for your home?" The boy nodded. "The storm last night blew out our lantern. My mother's been sick, and it's too dark for her to see in the evenings." The woman counted the coins he placed on the counter. They were not enough. She looked at the boy, his clothes thin, his hands red from the cold, and without a word, she added a small jar of honey to the package. "For her tea," she said, pressing the bundle into his hands. His eyes widened, and he stammered something that might have been thanks before hurrying back into the rain. She watched him go, the bundle held tightly against his chest. and felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire burning in the hearth. Later that day, as the rain began to ease, a traveller stopped by. He was a tall man with a worn satchel and a kind face, weathered by many roads. He bought a few items: bread, a packet of dried herbs, and as he paid, he asked if there was an inn nearby. She gave him directions and, noticing the tired slump of his shoulders, offered him a cup of hot tea before he went on his way. They sat together for a while in the quiet shop, the rain softening to a mist outside. He spoke of the villages he had passed through, of rivers swollen with the season's rain, of strangers who had shown him unexpected kindness. "It's a strange thing," he said thoughtfully. "The more I give away, the more I seem to have. Not in coins, but in something better." She nodded, understanding without needing to explain. Kindness had a way of multiplying, of finding its way back to you in shapes you didn't expect. She had seen it in the way neighbours looked after each other during harsh winters, in the way a loaf of bread passed to one person might feed an entire family, in the way a candle and a jar of honey could mean light and comfort to someone who had little else. By evening, the rain had stopped entirely, leaving the streets washed clean. She stepped outside and breathed in the cool, damp air. The sky was heavy with clouds, but along the horizon, a faint band of gold showed where the sun was setting. As she closed the shop for the night, she thought about the boy with the candle and the traveller with the tired eyes. Neither might ever meet, but both now carried something of this day with them. A small gift, a shared moment, a reminder that even the smallest act of generosity could travel far, like ripples spreading from a single drop of rain in a still pond. And perhaps, she thought, as she banked the fire and drew the shutters, that was the truest kind of wealth. Not what you kept for yourself, but what you gave freely, trusting it would find its way into the hands and hearts that needed it most. The village lay in the quiet embrace of twilight, the last light of the sun spilling gold and rose across the horizon before sinking into the hills. Smoke curled gently from chimneys, carrying the smell of hearth fires and evening meals through the cool air. Down the main street, lanterns were being lit one by one, their warm glow pushing back the shadows. It was the kind of evening that invited reflection, a gentle slowing of the day's rhythm. At the edge of the village, near the old stone well, an elderly man sat on a worn bench. His cane rested against his knee, and his gaze wandered over the rooftops, the fields beyond, and finally up to the first stars beginning to show. His name was Elias, and for as long as anyone could remember, he had been a quiet presence here. The man who listened more than he spoke, who knew the history of every family and every building, and whose advice was sought in matters both small and great. That evening, a young woman approached him. She had lived in the village all her life, but had only lately begun to feel the weight of her own choices pressing in on her. She greeted him with a respectful nod and asked if she might sit. He smiled and gestured to the space beside him. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the faint laughter drifting from the square and the distant bark of a dog. At last she spoke. "I've been feeling lost," she admitted. "I'm not sure which path to take. Everyone tells me something different. Some say I should leave the village and see the world. Others say I should stay here and build a life where I was born. I keep waiting for the answer to feel clear, but it doesn't." Elias nodded slowly. I understand, he said. When I was your age, I thought wisdom meant knowing all the answers. But I've learned that sometimes wisdom is knowing which questions to ask and when to be still long enough to hear the answers that take time to arrive. She frowned slightly. But how do you know if you're making the right choice? He leaned back, resting his hands on the bench. There's a proverb, he said, his voice carrying the weight of memory. In all your ways acknowledge the truth, and your path will be made straight. It doesn't mean the path will be easy or short. It means that if you walk honestly, with yourself, with others, the path you take will lead you where you are meant to go. The young woman considered this, turning it over in her mind. So you're saying, it's not about choosing the perfect road, but about walking whichever one I choose with the right heart. Elias smiled. Exactly. A road is just a road. It's who you are while walking it that shapes where it leads. They fell silent again, watching as more stars pierced the deepening blue above. In the square, someone began playing a tune on a fiddle, slow and lilting, the kind of melody that felt like an old story told without words. Elias shifted his cane and stood, slowly but steadily. Come. Mbuz, panning scared, walk with me. They moved down the quiet street, past doorways spilling light onto the cobblestones. As they walked, he pointed out the different houses. The baker's home, where a boy had once left to become a sailor, and later returned to teach others the trade. The cottage where a widow had raised 3 children alone, each of them now grown and thriving. The shop that had nearly closed during a hard winter, but survived because the neighbours brought what they could to help. Every one of these people had to choose their path, Elias said. Some stayed, some left, some changed direction halfway through. But the thing they all share is that they walked their path fully, with care, with effort, with honesty. That is what makes a life. When they reached the old bridge at the edge of the village, they stopped. The river below caught the starlight in glimmers, moving steadily toward somewhere unseen. Elias rested his hands on the worn stone railing. The river doesn't need to see its end to know how to flow, he said. It moves forward, carrying what it must, shaping its course as it goes. You can be like that. The young woman looked at the water, at the stars reflected there, and felt something loosen inside her. Not an answer exactly, but the easing of the fear that had been holding her still. She realised she didn't need to have the whole journey mapped before she began. They walked back into the village, the lanterns glowing warmly ahead. As they parted, Elias said softly, "Whatever road you choose, walk it with an open heart. That will be enough." And as she made her way home, she felt for the first time in many weeks that it might indeed be enough. The night seemed gentler, the stars brighter, and the path beneath her feet, though still uncertain, felt steady and worth taking.